We're live now, are we?
That's lovely. Mr. Chairman, please proceed.
Thank you. Hello and welcome to this online meeting on Monday, 17th of August 2020. I'm Councillor Lewis Barber. I'm Councillor for Lexington and Braeswick Ward and I will be chairing the meeting this evening. This meeting is being broadcast live via Zoom over the internet on the Council's YouTube channel and will also be available to watch afterwards. To begin with, there are a few matters of housekeeping, with the exception of the Democratic Services Officer advising us, would participants all please mute their microphones unless they are invited to speak. I will ask for each item of business to be presented and then ask each member of the panel in turn if they wish to ask a question or comment. At the end of each item of business, I'll ask each panel member in turn to confirm audibly how they wish to vote. We may have a break at 7:30 PM subject to the progress of business. If I can go round now the panel to introduce themselves, and I'll do it in alphabetical order, starting with myself, Councillor Barber, Lexington Braeswick Ward, chairing the meeting this evening, and then next to Councillor Tina Bourne.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Councillor Tina Bourne, Greensted Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Paul Dundas.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Paul Dundas, Stanway Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Chris Hayter.
Thank you. Councillor Chris Hayter, St Anne's and St John's.
Thank you. Councillor Mike Hogg.
Councillor Mike Hogg, St Anne's and St John's Ward.
Thank you. Councillor Sam McCarthy.
Good evening, Councillor Sam McCarthy, Shrub End Ward.
Councillor Lorcan Whitehead.
Good evening, Councillor Lorcan Whitehead, Newtown and Christchurch Ward.
And finally, Councillor Dennis Willets.
Dennis Willets, Lexington and Braeswick Ward.
And we have Councillor Julie Young and Councillor David King on the call, but I'll let them introduce themselves when we get to the relevant items, as well as with officers who are going to be speaking. Then we have the sole substitution this evening, which is Councillor Willets for Councillor Bentley this evening. And on item 3, there are no urgent items scheduled for this meeting. Item 4, do any councillors have any interests for any of the items that are on the agenda this evening?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vipont has his hand raised.
Okay, Ian, would you like to?
Thank you, Chairman. I just think for the purpose of transparency, I should say that I am a director of both the tendering Colchester Borders Limited Company and the Colchester Braintree Borders Company, both of which are dormant subsidiaries of NEGC Limited. Thank you.
Councillor David King, I saw you raise your hand too.
Thank you, Chair.
On the panel.
I should declare that I am this council's representative director on NEGC Limited.
Thank you. And Councillor Jay Young, I saw you raise your hand as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am declaring a personal interest in respect of my directorship or alternate directorship of NEGC.
Thank you very much. I think that was everyone for this item. Going on to item 5, which are the minutes. There are no minutes to approve at this meeting. Item 6, nobody given notice that they wish to speak under general have your say. Item 7, there are no urgent decisions to note. Item 8, there are no cabinet or portfolio holder decisions called in for this meeting. And then item 9, which is items requested by members of the panel and other members, there are no such requests from councillors. Which moves on to the main item this evening, which is item 10, which is on North Essex Garden Communities Limited and the project and the update on the financial items. The officers who are presenting this particular item are Ian Vipont and Paul Cook, and we've also got Councillor King and Councillor Julie Young, who I'm sure may wish to comment and be available to answer any questions to alongside officers. The recommendations, there is no recommendations currently on the paper, so we will consider the report and make any appropriate recommendations to Cabinet, I guess, depending on how the debate goes. So if I can invite Paul and Ian to introduce the paper for this evening, if they wish to get started, and then I'll go round afterwards. If anyone has any comments, I can. Sorry, Owen. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I've just noticed Councillor King's hand was raised.
Oh, I am keeping an eye out. I was just about to say, actually, I will keep an eye out on the blue hands, but it's not been a good start there. So, Councillor King.
Thank you, Chair. And the challenges of looking out for us, let alone yourself, all understood. Before we start, the three opening and contextual points are important for the record and for this conversation. Before the Strategic Director Ian Vipond and the Section 151 Officer Paul Cook, as you've invited them, takes you through the paper, and we all take Q&A alongside Councillor Young as you may need. Firstly, I understand I'm the only local or central government representative invited to appear, neither Conservative government representatives or officers or the leaders of Essex County Council, Tendring or Braintree councils, or the Chair, John Spence, of NEGC Limited will be here. I have to say, and you know my support for scrutiny process, that suggests a more overtly political, less independent hearing than usual, but we'll see. The report, however, fully answers each of your requests for information and reminds us all this is a multi-partner, multi-year project actively encouraged and supported by the government, their ministries, their department, Homes England and others, and which has succeeded in attracting government funding of nearly £100 million for the A133, A120 link road and a rapid transit service into Colchester. Thirdly and lastly, I ask the panel, whatever the disagreements of the past, to welcome what has been done by our officers and others and what has been achieved. We will have infrastructure investment. We do have an agreed garden community. Done well, that will bring high quality homes and sustainable travel investment and a quality of life that we elsewhere have agreed between us as members is hard to secure by any other means. That requires us to work with our partner local authorities and to move on from this NEGC project as we form another, and to do so mindful of the housing supply challenge. That, as members will know, is now near doubled by the government, and if followed through, would mean in Colchester, we will not have to provide 920 homes a year, but over 1,600 homes a year. So this project, when you look at this, and the focus starts narrow with the money, but I suspect will rightly and understandably go wider. This project hasn't over-delivered. Shared with tendering, we might have a quarter of a decade's new housing supply. But it requires us, for even that small contribution to the task placed upon us, to work with our partners and to move on from this examination of the past. I'll pass to Ian and to Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor King. I was not going to say too much by way of introduction into the paper, which is essentially, as I say, responding to questions asked, but it is perhaps worth giving a little bit of background context, I think, to the NEGC project, what we come to know as the NEGC project and NEGC Limited. It's fair to say they came out of discussions that go back to 2013, some time ago, when we began to consider options for the local plan and raised issues which were essentially where the next allocations for housing and employment would be located in the borough, and the knowledge that we would need strategic locations if we were to accommodate the scale of development, even then, that we knew we would have to find. Those conversations led to some strategic discussions with our neighbours, both Braintree and Tendring, largely because in terms of the local plan work for the borough, it's been recognised that a lot of development had occurred north of Colchester town and was probably reaching its limit in terms of allocations south of the A12, and also that south of the town was a more difficult location for development given various environmental issues associated with Roman River Valley. It's fair to say then that by the end of 2014, those conversations had progressed with neighbouring districts who were both in a position where they were looking to have a local plan themselves and beginning to think about how their development could best be accommodated going forward. So by or via those conversations, the potential for significant developments, both on the Tendring border with Colchester and the Braintree border with Colchester, were being considered. And as a response to that, by November 2015, the first informal shadow board between those three authorities and inviting Essex County Council into that board was held. That was significant because by December 15, the first DCLG grant award was given to the project. That was £640,000, a substantial grant by anybody's views for this sort of project. And it's fair to say that really from that 15-16 grant, there were then always, every year thereafter, funds supplied by government towards the project. By January 16, Cabinet had agreed to delegate the responsibilities to a portfolio holder to sit on the shadow board. And importantly, even at that stage, that's January 16, had agreed to be the banker for that grant and subsequently took on the, what we might call the banker role for all of the project going forward. So even at an early stage, we were the banker. By November 16, Cabinet had agreed to form NEGC Limited and agreed to appoint a director to that company, and had agreed, importantly, that local delivery vehicles, themselves companies, would be set up with a view to entering into agreements with landowners. And that was probably the key reason a company was created between the authorities, because at that point, if we'd wanted to enter an agreement with any third party, particularly the landowners, there would have needed to be a company to do that. So that really was the rationale, in a sense, for the creation of the company at that stage. And that was noted and endorsed by full council in December 16. And indeed, the principle of providing the necessary funding for all of those companies was agreed at that full council meeting back in December 16, subject to appropriate business cases and business plans coming forward for the future options for the prospective development. All, of course, subject to the local plan. And the local plan obviously was at that stage proceeding, if you like, on a different line in terms of through its statutory hurdles. So since that period, December 16, there have been a number of cabinet decisions and scrutiny decisions about various elements of the budget for the project. And it's important, as we note in the report, to separate out the project budget from the company budget. Because although NEGC Limited was created at that relatively early stage, there wasn't any actual funds going through the company. When it appointed its managing director, then essentially the salary and some associated costs around that post were put through the company. But the company never took on the role of dealing with the project sums in a direct sense. Those were always held by the local authorities as Colchester Borough Council as the banker for those sums. Chair, that's all I was going to do by way of a short introduction to the project. I don't know if Paul wants to do anything further on the report itself or not. So I'll turn to Paul just to see if he wants to add anything at this stage.
Thank you, Ian. Paul, was there anything you wish to add on top of what Ian said?
I could either sort of run briefly through the report and the different sections, Chair, or I can just pick up questions on the finance elements as we go along. I don't know which you prefer.
Would it be possible just to run through some of the detail first briefly, and then maybe questions can be picked up from that, please? Thank you.
So starting on page 9 of the agenda, just basically sets out the questions you raised, Chair, and going on to page 10. And then, as Ian was saying, we explained that we're talking about two separate things, NEGC Limited within the wider NEGC project. And then there's an overview of the project. I think Ian's been through that really. And then the financial implications, perhaps I'll just come on to that when we actually get in the detail of Appendix A. But I would point out the fourth bullet there on page 11 in 7.1, the fourth bullet. There have been a couple of significant changes since the report was prepared. The first is that the winding up cost included what was the original estimate of 100k for ceasing membership of the Essex County Council Pension Fund, and that we now got the actuary's report a few days ago. That has now become a surplus of 21,000. So that's an improvement in 121,000 in the project funds. Plus the NEGC team have been working quite actively on some of the outstanding orders, particularly with some of the consultancy firms. So taking into account some savings there, the current forecast of the surplus or the reserves available after winding up would be about 400,000, we think, though it's still an ongoing position. So unfortunately, some of that information only came in the last few days. So then capacity funding, which again, we've got a detailed appendix, just explain the amounts that we secured in 1890 and 1920, and that it was paid by MHCLG as an unring fence grant. I'll come on to more detail in the appendices. Shaping the future consultation costs, that's also an appendix, so I'll come to that. And then the carrying costs, I think just setting out there, it's reasonably normal arrangement when there's partnership between local authorities for one authority to act as the banker. So we do this for the Joint Museum Service with Ipswich, the North Essex Parking Partnership, and we did it for NEGC. So got some more information about those costs. So if that's okay for the main report, Chair, I'll just go on to Appendix A, which sets out in the first set of rows the overall position up to the end of 1920. The figures for 1920, as I think I've discussed with Councillor Dundas before, assume the 350 income from Colchester and that 340 of carrying costs would be met. But then the columns to the right of that reflect the periods you asked information about, so April 19 to January 20, February 20 and March 20, they exclude any assumption about the Colchester contribution, but similarly they exclude the carrying costs from the expenditure. And then in the penultimate column and the end column, we've got the management accounts for the first quarter, and then an estimate to the winding up of NEGC Limited, which I think, as I explained earlier, you know, this is sort of work in progress. So we think the balance of the reserves probably be closer to 400,000. That would be a matter for discussion between the partners as to how that were distributed. And then there's more detail in the section below of the different elements of the expenditure and income. And right at the bottom, 3 rows up, it shows the element of those costs for the project, which are NEGC Limited costs formally, which are essentially the group managing director and some small insurance costs. So, I mean, I hope that's useful in answering the financial questions, which I'm sure we'll come back to. And if more detail is required, that could quickly be provided or to a future meeting, depending what the panel is looking for. And on capacity funding, when applying for this unring fence grant, I've provided the applications that were made, which essentially is how the funding was expended, because these are quite broad categories. Let me go down a bit further. If you look on page, let me have a look. Probably the 1920 claim makes it a bit clearer. So if you go to page 26, sorry, 1819, there's certain standard categories set out under section 6 of the application by Homes England. So staff resource, master planning and design. And when applying, you indicate, you know, how much of the grant you think will be required for that area. I would say that all those categories, we probably have expended that amount of money on that particular activity, sort of exhausting the grant, plus other elements have been funded by partner contributions or reserves carried forward. So that is pretty much how the thing is monitored. So the next year's application almost becomes confirmation of what's happened in the previous year and an application going forward. So that's capacity funding. Then if I move quickly on past that, Chairman, on page 32, I've set out a summary of the Shaping the Future consultation costs. If the panel requires more detail, you know, that could be provided down to a lower level if required. And then in Appendix D, I give some information about the Colchester Borough carrying costs. So there are 2 officers there whose cost was met initially directly by Colchester, the planning officer and the programme officer. At a later stage, their payroll costs were paid directly from the project reserves, so it didn't become part of the carrying cost. And then there are also SLA costs for items that have been provided by CBC on behalf of NEGC. So I hope it's not too much detail. I've actually provided a copy of the SLA breakdown for 1819 and 1920. So you can see it includes, Chair, things like accommodation in Rowan House, provision of ICT, some support for procurement, finance, although NEGC has its own account, and there's obviously the payments, use of the finance system. So pretty standard items we'd include in SLA. That's 1819, and then on page 35, the 1920 figures, and finally on page 36, which would form part of the discussion with partners. We think we probably expended about 44,000 in 2021. So although the reserves were diminished in some of the NEGC reports by 34,000 because of the difference between the assumed Colchester income and the Colchester carrying costs, we've got additional carrying costs that we haven't included in the discussion. So those carrying costs, excuse me, Jim, those carrying costs plus the SLA for 2021 would broadly equate to the 350k. So just in conclusion, Chair, I think there's the element that unfortunately quite late in the day we found out differences in the costs for the pension deficit, and we think we're doing better on some of the procurement. Other areas of the questions we've tried to set out a reasonable level of information in the report, but if any further information is required, you know, we'll do our best to provide it as quickly as possible. I hope that's useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and Ian, for your contributions there. Councillor Julie Young, was there anything you wanted to add at this stage at all, or would you just want to make yourself available for any questions or follow-up comments from the panel?
Well, I just have a few words, if I may, Chair. I just think that, you know, that for me has been a really helpful run through, a bit of detail about the project and the financial details around how money has been attributed and received from government to support this project. But, you know, I'll be interested to see what questions arise from the members of the panel. But it kind of strikes me that this is a project that the government wholeheartedly supported. And that's why, you know, at the outset, they were prepared to put funding into the scheme to get it off the ground, and to continue providing financial support for that as it went along, subject to us fulfilling the requirements of the Garden Communities Principles, which I think certainly there's no question that we were aiming to do that. And I think I just would add that as a result of that, government sought to provide that 99.9 million in infrastructure funding to support that development over on the east side, and probably a little bit too late, but awarded the 272 million to support the infrastructure improvements needed to the A12 to make it possible to progress the Braintree border west of Braintree proposals as well, but probably came a little bit late, if I may say, Chair, for the inspector to take that into consideration when he made his recommendations that those garden communities were not viable. But I think, you know, that for me is the essence of it. This was a government project that certainly found favour, and I think Colchester Borough Council have tried to respond to the initiatives put before us to deliver large-scale housing, you know, in the best way we thought possible through this project. But I'll leave it there, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor Young. I'll just, before I go round, I'll go alphabetically to invite comments and questions from the panel, but I'll just address the point in particular Councillor King made, because I was actually going to add some context on this before the start of panel members' contributions, is that I made a personal decision as chair not to invite the other authorities at this stage. It was a discussion we had in the briefing, and not everyone agreed with that decision I made, but it was one I made because I felt that before we invited other authorities to a discussion with us, it was better if we had a discussion first, a non-political discussion among us on scrutiny to go through some of the detail. I felt there was merit in doing that. I don't think it removes the option of discussing with the other authorities in the future to understand how we can work better with them. But I just felt, before we invite the neighbours round, let's have a kind of our own family get together and a discussion first. And I felt there was a merit in that entirely. And that is how we got here today. We are obviously elected to Colchester Council, all of us, and we are here to scrutinise Colchester Council's involvement, which it freely and willingly entered into itself. So I hope the discussion is fruitful and can improve decision making in the future and help us learn lessons from the past and understand exactly what happened and what the processes were. I will leave any questions or comments I have till we've gone round everybody once at least. If I start with Councillor Bourne, do you have any comments or questions for officers or the Cabinet members who are in attendance this evening?
I've got a couple to start off with. I'm sure I'll have some more during the course of the evening. Thank you, Chair. I do think that as you've started the analogy of inviting the neighbours round, probably in this instance, we'd be asking them to bring a bottle, we drink it ourselves, and we wouldn't provide any tea or coffee or refreshment and then send them home, because I don't know if our neighbours would want to come round at the moment, seeing as we're not paying our bills. However, you want to keep it non-political tonight, so I'll carry on in that vein. Can officers, it's really helpful for Ian Vipon to outline the history of this Garden Communities project. It is North Essex Garden Communities, and I was one, Chair, thank you for mentioning it, that thought if we are going to learn lessons from this, then really we should do it in the round with all of our partners at the table at the same time. That's how we do it with Colchester and Ipswich Museum Service. That's how we've done things with the One Colchester project that we have been running very successfully. That's how we do it with the Crime and Disorder Panel when we get with the police. We learn things together, we hear the same things together, and we don't talk about them behind their backs. So I think I'm not sure whether we're going to get to the point where we will be able to do that. I do hope we can. Can I ask the officers, apart from the examples that Ian Vipond gave us regarding sometimes each local authority takes a different lead on things, was there any particular reason why Colchester was chosen to be banker above the others? I know that Braintree hosted the website. I can't remember what tendering's role was, and Essex will have done something as well. But in this particular instance, each local authority normally in these kinds of partnerships does something to put into a project. So is it always Colchester as the banker, or was it just our turn this time?
Thank you, Councillor Bourne. Ian, do you want to start?
I think if my memory serves me right, we always have very good financial officers in Colchester. I think at the time it would have been Sean Plummer as lead, and I think he was on the finance group, and I think that was certainly one of the reasons that the others felt that we had the capability to do that. I think there was an element of originally there were a number of garden communities sort of being suggested, but we certainly had, if you like, our involvement in two. And at that stage, we probably were physically the more central authority. So I think that was the other reason that perhaps we ended up with that role. I don't think there was much, as Councillor Bourne has said, there were other duties provided to others. Essentially, county role took on, for example, the communication type role. That was a classic example of that being shared out.
Thank you. Ian, Paul, was there anything you wanted to add in respect to the questions from Councillor Bourne?
No, I think that's okay, Chair, because the decision to, make Colchester the bank sort of predates me by some considerable time, so I don't really have any knowledge on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bourne, for now, were you satisfied in the responses you got? I'll come round again before the end of the item, but
yes.
Okay. I'm muting myself. Thank you very much. Next up, Councillor Paul Dundas. Do you have any questions or comments?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I have got some questions. I think I've got 7. I think that scribbled down at the moment. But I just wanted to make a few comments beforehand because I just wanted to put my questions into context because I don't really want them to be misconstrued as to where I'm sort of heading with them. I think really all of this is about finding out what's been done and how we can improve for the future. And remember that we do have a duty as councillors to look into how money is spent. And I think going forward with the tendering garden community, I think it is important that we learn from this what we could have done better and what we did wrong. So when we form a new joint project, we don't make any of the same mistakes if mistakes have been made. I also just want to make clear, it isn't about individuals. I accept a lot of people put an enormous amount of time and effort into this over a number of years. And on a personal level, I know it must be very disappointing to see a fair chunk of work not bring all that was intended to fruition. And I do really feel for people on that. And I am also aware that with the demise of NEGC, some people are going to lose their jobs. And I don't think that's something any of us should celebrate at all, particularly at the current time. I also think it's a debate about housing. I think that's a different debate for a different time. It's about this particular project, how it was run, what was spent, and where it's ended up. And I also recognise, as was mentioned, that a lot of the talk about the money is about the projects. And when we're talking about deficits or debts or anything, we're not talking about a conventional limited company and the rules around how that's run. I just think my feeling looking at this, and I came into this very, very late, is that there's been quite a lot of groupthink, I think, went on in NEGC, that it's almost as if there wasn't that much consideration given to the idea that it might not fully succeed. And it was almost as if nobody should ever mention it or talk about it, because if you do that, it's sort of tantamount to admitting that it might be possible. And that's very common. It's very common in projects. It's very common in companies. That's not really a criticism. It's an observation. Anybody who did that, it is not the first time that it'll happen, and it's certainly not the last, but it's something you always have to be aware of. So I'm trying to ask the questions in a constructive manner. I'm not having a go at anybody or trying to really make a sort of particular point or anything. So my questions, and this has actually been superseded a little bit by something Mr. Cook said earlier about the updated figures. The figures on Appendix A on page 13 give the financial situation with and without the CPC money. I do have an issue with the idea that if the money is not awarded, it's written off from both sides of the balance sheet. I just don't think that's right. And I think we need to give an honest financial view as to how it is. The removal of a payment doesn't mean that you can unilaterally remove the carried costs, because CBC hasn't agreed to write them off. A debtor can't do that. You can't write off money to a creditor, even if you don't want to pay it, you're not going to pay it, or you can't pay it. We'd all like to do that in life. I'd like to do it with my gas bill, but I can't. So just on the figures we've got, can you confirm that with the carried costs owed to CBC, the correct position on this paper, and I accept it's just been updated, is that the August 2020 close down would show a negative reserve figure of 173,000. Now, with the pension changes, which is very positive, and with the other changes, it looks as if we're getting into a positive situation, and that is very good. And it also means that the close down costs are much closer to those given to us before Christmas, so that's good. So that's my first question. My second question is, after the Colchester 1920 budget was only passed with the 350,000 removed, it must have been quite clear there was a question mark over whether that money would ever be paid. So I'm just wondering what advice was actually given to NEGC by CBC as the likely percentage chance of it ever being approved by full council. My third question leading on from that is following that 1920 budget in February 2019, excluding the 350,000, were there changes made to the NEGC 1920 budget now that the money could not be guaranteed? And were there any changes made to planned expenditure when it was confirmed as not being awarded in December 2019? My fourth question is whether anybody would concede that the £85,000, and I accept it's a very small amount of money in the context of a multi-million-pound project, but whether anybody concedes that spending that on the Shaping the Future consultation in hindsight, and hindsight's a wonderful thing, I accept that, was maybe unwise, because although some of the feedback from tendering may be useful, a lot of it won't be now. And it was really far from vital at the time that we did it then. It could have been done much later on. And you know, it has made the end figures for the project as to whether it's in surplus or deficit a lot closer than perhaps they would be. So that 85,000 might have actually made a bit of a difference. Number 5, I just wonder if anybody involved with NEGC could comment on their level of satisfaction with the external consultancy and legal services we engaged, or they engaged, for the January 2020 further hearing sessions. I just wonder if anybody's got any opinions on that. Nearly there. On question 6, with regard to the capacity funding bids, did any directors request, or were they presented with any budget variances or environments where actual spending may have been different to the section stated in the bid documents, and was approval given by the directors for those changes? And my last question, which I think Paul Cook has almost answered actually, the CBC carry costs of 350,000 are stated as being up to April 2020. Are there carry costs being accrued for the period April 2020 to date, and also down to the remaining period to the end of August? And if so, what are they? I think you might have answered that question, so my apologies, but if we could just have clarity on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dundas. Paul or Ian, did you want to come back on any of the comments or the 7 questions that Councillor Dundas has raised? I've tried to note them all down, so if you want a refresher or anything, do let me know. I'm furiously scribbling there, hoping to keep up.
Do you want me to have a go, Chair, and then Ian can come in if there is?
Yeah, of course.
I mean, I think the presentation of Appendix A, I'm happy with the way Colchester contributions and the carrying costs are treated. So I would say the estimated position at the end of August would be a surplus of about 400,000. That is very much work in progress. So I hope that answers the first question. The second question, I think, and I don't have the text with me, the decision of the council was not to release the payment rather than to dispense with it altogether. I don't have the text, Chair, for that. So that's why it still continued to be accrued. The 85k, perhaps Ian could answer that one. The NEGC level of scrutiny of consultants, I think perhaps Ian might want to come on that one. I think try to explain with the capacity fund. It is an unring-fenced grant. So year 1, you make an application indicating the main areas that the grant will be used for. And year 2, you sort of state the progress in year 1 and bid afresh into year 2. So I'm not aware there's a formal process to say that the allocation is a fixed figure for particular sums. That's a sort of, that's a bid for funding. and monitor whether those precise amounts have been spent, because those categories in the bid submission are fairly broad categories, and there's no doubt that we have expended that amount of grant in the relevant financial years, I would say. And finally, the carrying cost, yes, I think we have covered that, that would be the last page of the report. Some carrying cost has accrued in 2021. So I think that would be part of the discussion with partners as to the distribution of the surplus. I hope those are useful. I don't know if you wanted to come in on some of the others, Ian.
Just sorry, Ian, very briefly, I saw Councillor King had his hand raised, so I didn't know if he wanted to interject on any points first, if that's okay with you, Ian.
Sure.
The last thing I want to do in such a lovely evening is extend it for anybody, but I think Councillor Paul Dundas was as much asking after what was it like inside the hot and sweltering room when we were getting the welcome news that there was a hesitation, shall we say, at Colchester. And I think Paul's dealt with the facts in a fair way, and they are what they are. And my difficulty is I can only give you, Paul, the view of one attendee. And you know those who are on the board, and you will know them to be, they're your colleagues. Thoughtful people, dealing at pace with a fast-moving position in which government is the primary shareholder in practical terms behind the scenes, and the local authorities are working at the balance of the funding and therefore the approach. So the context was very much that. You know, that here was a really important, taken seriously, allow me my words, hesitation at Colchester, which I, as the council's representative and my colleagues on the board, took, as I say, really seriously. But while we were still in the position that we could, and we were all the way through this, able to proceed with the project, and given that we were, and let's be frank, if there is genuinely a conversation and a willingness to do some learning, one would be that we never quite reconciled two things. One, a motion of the day in full council with the earlier agreement to be a shareholder. And you know, we've had some of us exchanges around what a shareholder means, and we could spend some time on doing that. You know, we had an obligation. We were locked together. The meaning in my view, both in law and in practice, is pretty clear. It's about rights and responsibilities exercised and jointly, and a really critical thing, which if we're again going to do some learning, we need to take on board. Because I do worry that we're going to damage our future relationships with these parties, and you may be the administration. It'll be your challenge to deal with, which is we're talking about the past and not the future, but we're always talking about not doing things, not, let's be frank, not meeting what was perceived, seen as, presented as, you know, a promise that would eventually be discharged by Colchester Borough Council. And not doing that has all sorts of consequences for trust, which takes us back to the shareholder agreement. Now, it's one thing in commercial circumstances, done with a commercial mind, it would have been absolutely explicit that what I've just said to you, which morally, nobody's really questioned, that if you say you do something and you commit to a project, that you stay with it all the way through. What we didn't do was, as government, learning here, and tendering will hold this council to account, I have to say. They made that publicly plain. What we didn't do was write it as if it was a commercial agreement, because we were and we are arms of government. So it's a part answer to your question, but I hope it gives you a sort of sense of how our colleagues in local government, with government behind our shoulder, how we view this, which is really, as I took it, not the essence of your points, which was around how seriously was it taken. It was. For we had a solvent project. We had 4 arms of government and central government's backing to go and do something which government still wants nationally to be done as its latest housing declarations, which I hope we'll together push back on, still wants us to deliver, which is extra housing. This was the vehicle of their choice. We were following government policies, Councillor Young expressed. I won't keep saying the same thing, but I think it's really important if we are genuinely going to do some learning, it is to accept we have to lock these things down, because this is a generational project. And if we, representing the councillors of the day, represent the generation ahead, then we have to take the kind of approach which is as simple as each one of us was brought up. Our words, our bond, right? And we lost our way, and understand why, by getting a contrast in positions, which was never fully reconciled. So inside the boardroom, all the detail was secondary to that reasonable assumption by our partners that with a solvent project and a government policy and a government backing, that we would get to a position that we would resolve that conundrum, shareholder versus a decision in council, which has given us the problem that we now recognise.
Thank you, Councillor King. I will let Ian Vipond come in, and then I saw Councillor Julie Young had her hand raised as well, so I'll come to her after Ian's finished.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, just to emphasise, I think that the point Paul was making, the 350,000 was in the council budget, and it was in the council budget to be spent on this project. It was the release of that funding that was required to go back to full council. So if you view it from a third party sitting outside, that would indicate that, if you like, in principle, the council was prepared to pay the 350 because it was in the council's budget, but a further decision was required in order to release it. In terms of the consultation, shaping futures consultation, this is, I think the question really is always, at what point do you do consultation, and how much consultation? And there was certainly at the time criticism around a lack of consultation. You take a personal view whether you think that was right or wrong, but certainly the NEGC project felt at that time that initial consultation in terms of beginning to explore some of the issues around the garden communities was worthwhile. I mean, clearly you take a judgment with hindsight, but clearly some of that consultation work with regards to tendering Colchester borders will be of use going forward. In terms of the level of satisfaction with consultants engaged with examination, I know we're not here to go through the examination, so I think it is fair to say that those involved from a planning perspective, providing the evidence for the council, were hugely impressed with the legal advice they got. The range of consultants on a range of issues largely won their planning case. So if you look at the issues like habitat regs, sustainable appraisal, etc., those were largely found to be satisfactory from the inspector. The issue primarily was around viability, and that was the key issue that turned, I think, the inspector in terms of shaped his final views. That's a tricky one, I think, in terms of expertise in trying to assess viability over the length of time so these projects will last. It would be perhaps flippant of me, and you just have to excuse it if I said, clearly government have announced in the white paper they are going to look at the viability question going forward, which sort of indicates that they themselves have a view on the issue of viability. Paul answered the question on environments from areas of funding over to another areas of funding. But again, I would just emphasize that way back in the original cabinet delegation around the company, that delegated authority to decide how grant funds were spent to the steering groups. That was a group of officers that was under, if you like, the NEGC board, but was the steering group of the project, which importantly contained a representative from Homes England. So at all times, any decision about how funding was used was done in full view of Homes England, and Homes England were in effect the government's agent for that funding. They, and in later years, you'll see, from the appendix that the applications were made to Homes England, but throughout, even when the funding came from the ministry, it was Homes England who were administering that grant, and they were always present at those steering group meetings. I think that was it, Chair.
Thank you, Ian. Councillor Young, did you want to come in now?
Yeah, I won't take too much of your time, Chair. I just wanted to focus on really the points that Ian Vipon was just talking about. In terms of the consultation, yeah, there was some criticisms around that at the time. I know in terms of the image on the front of the leaflet, for example, and where those consultation events were taking place. And I know that NEGC tried to respond to those criticisms and do things differently to meet the needs of local people. So I know, in terms of, Wivenhoe, for example, they were unhappy about there not being a consultation event in actually Wivenhoe. It was scheduled to be at the university, for example, and they responded to that. And I remember us talking about it in NEGC board meetings, and we felt very much that it was important to try and tell the story about what was being proposed, because there was a lot of behind closed doors conversations going on, and it had been going on for some time. But actually, what did the people of Colchester, Braintree and Tendring know about it? So I think, there's always a question mark about the appropriate time for consultation to take place. But it seemed to be, I remember, the criticism seemed to be coming from, predominantly older people, for example, and this is a project that will be for the future. So I remember John Spence being really keen to go to Colchester Institute, for example, and did some consultation there. And I know he, went to many of the consultation events to make sure he was the public face of NEGC and he was available to answer questions. And I think, just talking about, what the opinion was about council that we received in terms of the hearings. I mean, I remember I went to some of the last set of hearings, and I went to some of the first ones as well. And I do feel that our team on the second round of hearings was much better prepared and had all of the information absolutely drilled down, as Mr. Vipon has indicated. I think it's only a judgment you can make at a certain point in time. And for me, I feel, as I said in the opening comments, that had we have had the government announcement of the £272 million worth of infrastructure investment on the table, when the inspector made his recommendations, he might have come to a different conclusion about viability for the Braintree border garden community. But, we are where we are, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Young. Councillor Dundas, was there any follow-up before I move on to the next speaker? I will go around once everyone's had the chance to speak once more if you did think of anything.
Thank you, Chair. Nothing major, and I want to move on so other people can have their say. But I just, I mean, on the presentation of the financial situation, I think we'll just have to agree to disagree. I know in practice it doesn't make any difference because NEGC have said, well, they're not going to pay it. Well, fine, and I don't think it's really likely the CBC are going to pursue it. I just think as a final figure, they can't. CBC have specifically said they're not writing it off. So I just feel it should show it as being owed, and that is the final figure, which now looks as if it's going to be in surplus, which I think is a good thing. I just think it's a more honest presentation, and I can't change my opinion on that. I think on the general comments about going forward with these sort of projects over the long term, I think what we do need to learn from it is if you look back originally, you're right, and Councillor King's quite right. In the commercial world, you have it tied down very, very carefully. Unfortunately, we're in the political world, and politics changes. Politicians come and go. Political balance changes. And I think one of the things we had wrong in Colchester is if you look back to the original time when we set this project up, as far as I can work out, and I may be wrong, it was before my time, there wasn't unanimous support across the chamber for it in the first place. So there's always been this political division on it, and there was always the chance that, as the ratio of councillors changes and comes and goes, and perhaps there's another conversation about our yearly election cycles, that we can't do anything long term over 4 years because we never know where we're going to be the next May. So I think in future, we really need to try and at least start with any long-term projects where they've actually got the support across the chamber, or a big chunk of that support, because that will make it a lot easier to take them forward over a longer period of time as councillors come and go and administrations come and go. I think, yeah, I'm not going to make any more comments because I think I don't want to take any more time. But thank you for your intelligent and considered responses. It's much appreciated. And maybe, as Councillor King said, I appreciate we've only got you two here, Councillor King and Councillor Young, and as Councillor Bourne highlighted, I think if we take this any further forward at a future point, obviously we probably do need to expand it, because it's not fair that we're just putting all the questions on you and you can only give your opinions. So maybe if we take this forward in the future, we do need to expand it, or maybe have some sort of other, just not Colchester, overview of it to make it a little bit more reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Dundas. Councillor King, did you, before I go on to Councillor Hayter, did you want to follow up on that?
I did very briefly. Apart from thanking Paul, you always, the generosity of a remark is to be welcomed, however fleeting. It's always good to hear it. I think looking forward, my suggestion to the panel is not necessarily you try and repeat this. It's going to take quite a long while if you can get anybody together, and then it will be very similar. But I think there is absolutely a need to focus on what will happen with TCB. Now we're into, are we going to bid? How are we going to work? What's going to happen? How's that relationship going to be reset? Now that could be, a helpful use. The partners who are going to be our future partners, I would just suggest that while taking this learning, we will get some, and taking it forward and applying it to what counts as a productive relationship with our new partners, county, I assume, and tendering, and doing that productively. That's my recommendation to you. That's obviously your choice. And there's one other aside, which is that in terms of that difference between the commercial sector and government, I really can't sort of overstate this. What's happened here in Colchester, and I've asked elsewhere, and I've been in this game for 40 plus years, I've not heard anything like it. It just doesn't happen. There are disagreements, of course. They can be around, Paul Cook and his counterparts having a struggle around what are the carrying costs. There's that kind of conversation happens. But it is quite simply very, very unusual, rarity, to get in the position we've got in here. And actually, we should all be a bit sober about that. So when we look forward, is to make sure we don't do this again. But it does make excusable why there was such a simplistic shareholder agreement. People did not expect, quite reasonably, that we get into this position. But that's the learning. We can't we?
Thank you, Councillor King. Moving on to Councillor Hayter. Did you have any questions or comments?
I've got no questions as such, but comment-wise, yeah, I agree with what a few other people have said about how we do things going forward. I've got no answers to what we would do going forward, because it's all so new for me reading up on the last few years worth of this. This goes back a long time, and it's very complex, and it'd be very foolish to think that we could quickly fix something in a different way going forward and how we could work. Doesn't change where we are now. Yeah, it's continuing feedback tonight, and if there's anything I want to jump on later, I certainly will raise my hand.
Thank you very much. Next up, Councillor Mike Hogg. Do you have any questions or comments?
Thank you, Chairman. Just a clarification, if I can, please, with regards to the 400,000 approximately left in the kitty to be divvied up. Presumably, that money sits in our account until such time as it is divvied up. Where does that portion of our divvy up sit with regards to the TCB program? Is that moved forward into that program, or does it just sit as a separate entity in our accounts? Please, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hogg. Paul, did you want to respond on that particular issue?
I think that might be one for Ian as to how we use that resource moving forward. As Councillor Hogg says, you know, it is sitting in our accounts, but I believe there would be discussion between the parties as to whether that were distributed or taken forward into the single garden community.
That's right, Paul. I mean, I think again, important just to note that's not company money. That's project funds that were released by the authorities to advance the delivery of garden communities. I think it's fair to say that as Braintree do not have at the moment garden communities to advance, they might expect their proportion back, but I think it will be a decision ultimately for the portfolio holders. As I say, the money is authorised; it's been submitted for that project, so it will be ultimately for the portfolio holders of those three authorities to decide what they wish to do with that funding.
Thank you. We're not hopefully going to be in a position where we're being asked to hand it back.
Yeah, there's a nuance that obviously about 50% of the funding over the lifetime of the project to date has come from government. But I think I'm right in saying, Paul, that we believe that we can show satisfactorily that we have used all of the government grant last year towards the project. So there is no obvious reason why any of that funding has to go back to government.
I think in broad terms, Chair, we have spent at least the level of the grant allocations during 1920. So I don't think there's any question of clawback. And in fact, as a matter of regulation, it's an unring-fenced grant. So I'm not sure on what basis MHCLG could claw any grant back. But what Ian says is correct, that of those areas that we set out in our submission, we have expended at least that amount of resource in those areas, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a positive response. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hogg. Councillor Sam McCarthy.
Nothing from me at the moment, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Lorcan Whitehead.
Thank you. Yeah, I do have a couple of questions. I'll have to apologise if you can hear dramatic soundtrack in the background. My daughter's watching The Incredibles back there. So I think I'll ask one and then I'll pause and then ask the other. So my first one, I mean, it is a shame, I think, that our partners aren't here, because I think we hear CBC people talking about this a lot, defending the principles, talking about the benefits and all that side of it. And it would have been, I think, quite helpful for me, at least, certainly as someone relatively new to the council, to maybe have been able to ask those sorts of questions of our partners tonight. And I mean, I just wonder if, in lieu of them being here, and I know it's difficult to speak on other people's behalf, but if you could give us a flavour of what the sort of the initial conversations were like with this project, why we chose to embark on it the way that we did. The input, obviously, not just from the other local authorities, but from government as well. And why did we choose to pursue it and what was the views of the other local authorities that fed into that?
Thank you, Councillor Whitehead, and may I commend your daughter on an excellent choice of film. I reckon the best person to answer that might be Ian, possibly, because Ian, I think you're the only person from the start maybe here, because one of the points I was going to raise is that Councillor King in particular has only joined the board in 2018. So I don't know, Ian, I don't want to throw it completely onto you here, but if you're happy maybe to set the scene a bit.
I think if I speak as an officer, I was impressed that politicians from all the authorities were ambitious. Sorry, it's at times a fairly rare commodity in the sense that, as I think, as we've said, that we're often aware that politicians are perhaps thinking about the next election, which in this authority is virtually every year. We can get a break every 4th year, and that can limit ambition and forward thinking. And I think from some of those earlier conversations, I was always impressed, as I say, of the range of politicians from a range of political backgrounds who genuinely wanted to find a long-term solution for the problem about delivering development in a locality, and finding you were always short of the necessary infrastructure and probably not delivering the quality that the residents and businesses of this locality deserve. And whatever you think about the content of the white paper doing circulation at the moment, you can see a similar sort of agenda, a real desire, and if you like, to meet some of those issues about quality and how you get infrastructure. So I think that's what bound the partnership from an early stage. In if I dare say at a political, it's not really for me to comment on others in terms of their political judgment why they were there, but I think they all had that approach, which was useful, as I say. It certainly helped the officer context in terms of being able to get on with the work behind those ambitions. I don't know if that helps, Chair.
Thank you, Ian. Councillor Whitehead, I just saw Councillor King raise his hand, so I'll let him come in before coming back to you. Councillor King, did you want to jump in here?
A correction, it feels like 2 years, but it's only a year. So 2019, it's Tim Young, but a moment to say just that. But I'm just going to offer that the politicians together, in my view, and of course I'm speaking to them, aren't I, can have passion and a desire to do good and do better. And I will just say, in my year or more, I saw that repeatedly, and actually to see, and that's not to be disrespectful of those and several here on this call who take a different view. Garden community principles are easy principles to align yourself to, but actually the sort of genuine sense of how badly the planning system can work, and a real sense of possibility, and that sense of possibility and the multiplier effect you get with significant investment, and that sense of generational impact. I mean, it's been an absolute pain, I'll be frank with you, but it's absolutely been also really great to have seen genuine commitment and a sort of a wish to go and do better and raise the game with an impact we know it will have upon our residents and others.
Thank you, Councillor King. Councillor Bourne, I saw you raise your hand. Did you wish to make a point? You're muted, by the way. Oh, no, you're not.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to know, although I was never on the board, I was on the cabinet when this was first in embryonic stages. And it's fair to say that at the time, 2013 through to 2015, there was definitely a level of anticipation and excitement. We know that Essex has long been the engine room of growth in the eastern region, and Essex pride themselves as a county on that. And a lot of that growth has happened in this part of Essex. And because of that, we have been able to attract an enormous amount of funding. And when the DCLG came down to talk to the Cabinet in those early days, I think it was 2013, might have been 2012, there was a level of frisson about, oh, this is something good, this is something that we can get behind. And certainly by meeting with the other parties that eventually went on to form North Essex Garden Communities, there was a level of them sharing in our growth, in this local authority's growth as well. And there's no doubt that authorities such as Tendring have had very difficult times in, for over a decade in attracting business in. And the idea is you raise others up through your own efforts and through your own good fortune. And that's what we felt as a local authority in Colchester we were able to do to the neighbouring authorities of Braintree and Tendring, who are slightly smaller and don't have some of the advantages that we have in our borough. So we're making the most of North Essex and sharing in that at the same time. And that attraction of interest really did help us to forge better relationships. We have the outfall from this is that we have really good relationships with Braintree and really good relationships with Tendring. We do a lot of work with those two local authorities, even though they are a different colour tribe to the administration from Colchester. It goes to prove that you don't need to be in the same party to have grown up responsible conversations with your neighbours and come to an agreement. And I think the frustration for us in North Essex as local authorities has always been the infrastructure. Our roads let us down. And with the North Essex Garden Communities, there was definitely a feeling that this is one way of improving our road system in North Essex and meaning that everyone could share in those very good possibilities we could have with transportation and what that means for attracting business into this area. So I hope we haven't lost that ambition, because when you share in ambition and when you go with ambition, sometimes it doesn't pay off. And all business people know this, but you have to, it's not even taking a punt, it's working with your neighbours in order to gain something bigger. And I really hope we haven't lost that now. And I really hope the recommendations from the Scrutiny Panel will share in that fairness and equity that we should have with Braintree and with Tendring, because we have to all be in this together. Colchester cannot be an island on growth.
Thank you, Councillor Bourne. Councillor Whitehead, did you want to come back on any of the points that were made?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have another, not to come back really, I mean, other than to say that I think that's very, very helpful actually from three different perspectives on the situation. And I'm certainly a big believer that when each of us does well, then we all do better collectively. So I think it's important to if we can help our neighbours to do as well as well. My other question is, I mean, I think it's a very interesting and thorny issue that that I think Councillor Dundas put his finger on with the situation with the question of the shareholder agreement and the contrast between the commercial situation and the political situation. And I think so I guess my question in a nutshell is, do we have any thoughts on what the solution is? I know Councillor King has mentioned about, or hinted towards the idea that we might need to, in future arrangements, be nailing things down on the basis that you might do more in a commercial arrangement. But I suppose part of me wonders or worries about that a little bit, because I do think Councillor Dundas has a bit of a point when he says that the political world is a bit different and things do change, and perhaps we have to allow for the possibility that that decisions can be can be altered. So I think that basically it's a dilemma, isn't it? Those are two very difficult things, and it's not entirely clear how we resolve them. And I suppose we've thrown up the question by, I mean, I guess the solution would have been that it's expected by convention, say, that we would just honour these agreements, whether or not they're nailed down. And we haven't, and I suppose that's thrown up this this question. So I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on the right way to navigate that dilemma in future. And I guess it may be an issue coming up with working with tendering on the garden community that's forthcoming.
Thank you, Councillor Whitehead. Councillor King, I see your hands raised. Did you want to reply?
I ever so briefly, Lorcan, you've described the conundrum, as I say. It has to be more than commercial. Of course, any contract that any organisation signs can be changed by agreement of the parties. So for me, it was about misunderstandings about scope, scale and commitment that meant we didn't have the quality of documentation matched in the way that we're going to have to. So when we move to the new project, and we say this gently because we'll still be, as Councillor Bourne described so well, we'll still be having a duty to cooperate. It'll still be in our interest. It will still be working within the web of constructive relationships we have. There's ambition, everybody has it. We'll be wanting to make sure that we can find a way that exploits that. But it is salutary. It is a salutary moment to realise the tangle we got ourselves into. And to Councillor Dundas's observations earlier, a lot of this will be about, as he put it, the degree of commitment there is across the chamber. Well, TCB should be easier in that respect than we have had with 3 large garden communities and all the fighting and struggle we've had to this date. So maybe we can reunite around our local plan and reunite around a progressive approach to the opportunity of TCB, and join up, frankly, to do the best for our people in the light of where government policy may be going. And that's not having any go at all, it's just a fact. So it's well described, the question, and we're going to have to work through it together and do some learning from this. The circumstances will be that much easier to address than they were when we had 3, should we say, partly wanted garden communities, and now we have one which we should take as a really constructive step forward.
Thank you, Councillor King. Councillor Young, I just saw your hand raised. If you wish to come in.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting discussion point that Councillor Dundas has raised and Councillor Whitehead has enlarged upon. And I suppose looking at it from an alternative standpoint, we're here today, scrutinising what's gone before with NEGC and throwing a light, I guess, on that shareholder agreement. But I think, 20 minutes down the road, there's probably another council that are also shining a light on an agreement that was reached, and they'll probably want a much more watertight agreement going forward, because, of course, the comments that came from Tendring District Council was about not being able to trust Colchester Borough Council, and that we've got to do some work in actually proving to them that we can be trusted going forward, because we will be in an arrangement with them on this project, but potentially in terms of political partnership going forward with the changes to local government. So those relationships we know are key to both of our successes. So it's something that we're going to have to get over this particular moment in time to make sure that we move forward collaboratively and constructively in the future.
Thank you, Councillor Young. I'm worried the time's coming up to 7:30 before I invite Councillor Willits to speak, and then before I make my comments or questions. What is the feeling of the panel? Do you want to take a short break before we carry on, or would you like to skip that and not worry? I suspect we won't be ages, but if the panel's minded to take the break, There's of course up to them. General feeling? Don't all speak at once. Okay, I'll invite Councillor Willits to speak, and then we can take a rain check after them if needed. Councillor Willits.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, for a non-political panel, we seem to have got through a lot of political stuff this evening, even if it is just the whys and wherefores. But I think one of the lessons that shines through is that in administration where there is a wafer-thin majority, it is unwise not to consult with the majority party in the council. Now, that was a problem of the past under the leadership of Leader Corey and portfolio holder for resources, Councillor King. I think things have improved dramatically. And had the project started with their view of cooperation and collaboration and talking, then I think some of these battles which we unnecessarily got into fighting would never have happened in the first place. But that is the political reality of life, that if you've got a wafer-thin majority, you cannot be sure that you're going to carry the council with you after you've made an agreement with another party, unless you've briefed it and you're really sure that everyone does subscribe to the same point of view. Chairman, the reason for being here this evening is actually to scrutinise the financial contributions to NEGC, although we've covered a lot of other political issues which are really tangential to that. And the question I think before us this evening is not should NEC the project have been carried out, but the thing that should be concerning the scrutiny panel is, was it carried out well? The money that's been spent, regardless of whether the project terminates or another one goes forward, was that money spent well? Was it good value for money given the conditions that prevailed at the time? Now, to my recollection, Chairman, we have scrutinised this particular issue 6 times. On one occasion, when we had a meeting at the Mercury Theatre, the requisite parties didn't show up, so perhaps it was only 5 times. But even after all that scrutiny, what has been a major piece of work for this scrutiny panel, it's never quite succeeded in obtaining the financial clarity that I was looking for in terms of what are we spending the money on? Was it well spent? Was it a good project, even if it has to stop short and another project take over? And that is the issue which I think we should be concentrating on this evening. My first remark is that there were 3 related financial functions which are interrelated to the extent that I've never been able to unravel them. And that is part of the problem that I've had scrutinising this project on the number of occasions that we have done. One is we're commissioning work in support of our own local plan. Secondly, we're commissioning work in regard to the overall NEGC project. And thirdly, we're acting as the banker to NEGC. And while many of the financial sheets that we've received throw some light onto the issue, there has always been this uncertainty in my mind about what we're talking about and how we actually identify whether each of these particular items of expenditure that we see allocated to the project was actually well spent. We lack clarity in what was being spent, by whom, and why. And of course, everything we spent on this project, we contribute a proportion to, so that there's nothing in this project in which we do not have a working interest. Now, I was around right at the beginning of this project, and there was a period when nothing really happened. Then suddenly the council sprung into life. We debated at length the governance arrangements. We debated at length the inter-authority agreements and the delivery issues, but we never really got to grips as a council with the project strategy, the related finance profile, the risks to the taxpayer in any meaningful detail. So not only did we not take those decisions at council, we've not really cracked that nut at scrutiny committee to ensure that those essential items of the project were done well. And I believe that that is the area we should actually be looking at to scrutinise. How well did we do on the decisions? Were they the right decisions? Did we spend the money wisely? These are strategic issues, Chairman, and we've had plenty of offline briefings, but no firm information, no really firm project budgets that we could scrutinise, no risk assessments that we could scrutinise, and the whole project was, to me, was just not solid enough to carry out the scrutiny function. Now, it may be the information was there, but it was not willingly released to the scrutiny panel. So what should the scrutiny panel be doing? Well, there are perhaps three major epochs in this project. The first one was back in October 2016, when the Cabinet commissioned Lord Kerslake to review, take a look at the approach to delivering on and he said, and if I can quote, the timetable for the local plan is ambitious given that the scale and complexities of the garden community. The council should take action to ensure local plans can have the best chance of being found sound in an appropriate time scale. Sustainability assessment and viability issues are necessary elements. And I think the whole of the work which we're doing should have been carefully aligned to Kerslake's very wise advice which he gave us, but I fear that it was not. But we've never as a scrutiny panel had a chance to identify whether that was the case. These are just feelings rather than scrutiny proof that we did well. The other two epochs, of course, were the first hearing and the second hearing by the government planning inspector, which did not give us the assurance that we were looking for. So running from 2016 to 2020, we had a series of planning activities on this project, and we had a series of contracts and payments to keep this project going. Some 8 million, although Kerslake's estimate was 5 million, and we have yet to receive a dialogue on why there was a significant difference between Kerslake's expert panel assessment of the cost and what they've actually spent to date. What I'm concerned with, Chairman, is the audit objectives, as I've said, proving that it was good value for money. What we need to scrutinise is the project plan, and that's something we've never done, and the associated contract and pieces of work and financial payments so that we can judge whether there was good value, whether in our opinion, the Scrutiny Panels Committee opinion, there was good value for this project. Now, within the project, it may well be that it looked like a very orderly process. But I must admit, looking at this project from outside, we had the impression of perhaps ending towards disaster, spending whatever was necessary to patch over the problems, dipping into the kitty to stave off every emergency, and perhaps keeping out the prying eyes of the scrutiny panel. And if I can give you a few examples, which perhaps I'm not sure whether we need to answer them in detail at this evening, but they are the issues which give me cause to concern that scrutiny has not been carried out effectively on this project. If we, for instance, pick the work done by David Locke Associates, it didn't fit in with the overall schedule of work. The level of detail was that which was not needed for another 5 years on this project. We're not sure who commissioned it and why. 8 payments totaling £91,000 are shown in the ledger. The work was then declared surplus to the requirements. The portfolio holder, Tim Young, at the time said he was perplexed at why this work was done and why it was ever carried out. And strangely, David Locke does not actually appear in the council's contract register, although 13 of the other contractors which have provided stalwart support to this project have. So, you know, just picking on one particular element of the project, and it was a high profile element which caused a lot of dialogue, does cause me significant worries that scrutiny was not properly carried out. If we choose a couple of other issues, there were the land deals, where if we look at the figures, we see that every year the project has been running, more has been spent on land deals, up to now an accumulative cost of almost 1 million. Started off modestly, £75,000 in the first year, but of course there were £152,000 in legal support and heads of terms drafting. And last year I think it had risen to £210,000 for land deals, plus of course the 200% on cost for legal support. Yet not one land deal has actually been signed. And surely this is the sort of issue that the Scrutiny Panel should be looking at. You know, how can it be so much money was spent on negotiating land deals, and we don't actually have one in the bag, not one to show, yes, we have made a deal, there's a plot of land somewhere which we've actually bought up, or bought up an option for it in the piggy bank. And then it's already been mentioned, Chairman, the consultations just before Christmas, where we had what was almost obscene 16 experts and consultants doing the rounds of the village halls in the west of the borough, knowing that the project was unlikely ever to proceed in its current form, yet we still went ahead, spent all that money, confused the public on why we were having consultations on something which was not going to go ahead. And Lord Kerslake and his specialist team review told us, he said, "We are convinced that Colchester Borough does not have sufficient resilient planning and delivery teams to manage two major garden community projects simultaneously." And that has certainly been proved right, but we don't know why, because we haven't had the opportunity to scrutinise. And apart from what we're doing this evening, which is checking that the books balance, you know, Appendix A is fine, you know, it gives us an overview of the figures. When we tot it up, they almost balance, apart from one or two changes which have been made. So scrutiny to date on this project really has been at that level. You know, look at the accounts, see whether the books balance. If they do, nod it through and send it on to Cabinet. So, yeah, £8 million of taxpayers' money has been spent. We don't know whether that's been squandered on the project. We don't know whether it's been wisely spent. We don't know whether the project was out of control and has veered off drastically from the Kerslake horizon. We don't know whether the work has been done well, because the scrutiny that has been carried out so far has not been structured to give us answers to these questions. And I believe that what we should now be doing is carrying out a proper piece of scrutiny work, looking at the project plan, the financial components which made it happen, and coming to a view on whether it was done well or whether it was done badly, whether there are issues that we can learn from that scrutiny. Now, I don't know whether the other members of the panel have really got the appetite to have a drains up, which will be resource intensive, but would help us considerably in renegotiating this type of activity, because we're going to have to do it again. And I think either the scrutiny panel should agree that we will do this work, or if we haven't got the appetite to do it, we should be looking for a formal independent inquiry, perhaps by our auditors, who might have greater powers to carry out a meaningful investigation and scrutiny of this particular work. So sorry I've gone on so long, Chairman, and I realise that, you know, sort of 10 minutes over the break time. But I really do think that we have missed an opportunity to do proper scrutiny of this project. Proper scrutiny will set us up, give us a much firmer foundation for doing a second stab at this project. And I think the decision we have to make this evening is, do we want to do it ourselves, or do we want an independent auditor to come in and do it forward, if we think that the history of the project and the sensitivities of the project are just too difficult for us to do it ourselves. So that's the question I asked this evening. Yeah, I'm not sure whether we have a break and think about it and come back and see whether we can answer that question. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Willits. We are now past the break deadline. I'm minded to continue unless anyone raises, because I don't think we will be too long now. So unless anyone raises to indicate they wish to have a break, I will just carry on the meeting. I'm looking for hands. I don't think there is anybody who wants to take the break. Oh, Councillor Young, sorry, there is a hand. Hello.
I want to take a break, Chair, right, and I'm happy to come in after Councillor King, but I just want to make a couple of responses to Councillor Willits. I mean, I just think that, you know, the comments you made about the timing of consultations and them being carried out, you know, in the west of the borough, at a time when we knew it wouldn't go ahead, you know, that was impossible to predict, because we were at that point preparing to go into the hearings, the public hearings in January. And, you know, as an authority, we believed in what we were putting forward. So did the other partners in this project. So, you know, therefore we proceeded with the consultation events based on the fact that we had confidence as we move forward with the project. And I do think it's slightly disingenuous to want to shine a light on the spending of £8 million, which has been spent as a collective. That's government and 4 local authorities. So you want to scrutinise the 8 million spending, and yet you only want, you know, representatives of this authority to this panel to answer the questions. So, you know, either we're scrutinising our own budget and our own responsibilities and what we've spent on it, or we're being asked to call to account to answer questions in the entirety of an £8 million spending. And that just isn't fair, Chair. So I just wanted to actually, you know, cover off those 2 points, but, you know, I'm obviously happy to come back later if need be.
Thank you, Councillor Young. I will just touch on that point after Councillor King, because I will touch on that point. Councillor King, did you want to jump in now?
Thank you. Just to round out the points, add to the points that Councillor Young has made, really. I mean, it's for me, without the history that most of you have, professionally, what a shame. I keep myself always kind of neutral. We should always want to know what counts as value for money. But here's a truth, that trying to unpick a project of this age and complexity with so many partners and come to a view after the event is at best a challenge, will be in itself expensive and consuming in resources, particularly if you bring somebody else in to do it, and will leave you with this much the same argument. I suspect we may find a few nuggets of truth on which we could agree, but it will bring us back to the same kind of starting point. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, some of the observations made about the lack of information, even in my short time here, I know are not true. I'm not saying that that isn't the case in terms of individuals' access or picking up what's floating by in a sea of information. But my understanding was that the board has a process in which information is regularly made available and published. That included, for example, project plans and strategic risk registers. So, you know, my understanding certainly is that there is quite a lot of information in the public domain, and quite rightly so. And I have to assume, and Councillor Willits, I wasn't in your shoes, but I have to assume that in the past, you and your counterparts did the very best you could to look at a complex project and to do so very robustly. So I wouldn't discount, you know, even though it's after the event, that the quality of scrutiny, which is intended to help the direction of this, you know, of this project. And the last thing for me is just about traditional value for money tests. And this will really show you how sad I am that I went and spent some time looking at the Treasury's Green Book this afternoon, because in past lives, looking at value for money and making those judgments, I found as difficult then as I would now. And I just say to you all, one of the few things you can do, and the Treasury still does require public comparatives. It asks you to construct the alternative future and then use that as a test against how you're working. But actually, most tests end up being against the only course that matters, the one you've taken, and then you look at the outcomes. So for this local authority, liked or not, whatever went wrong or not, the ultimate test is the clearest one, which is, what did we get from this? And the answer is a promise, which wasn't cashed in, of a couple £100 million on improvements in infrastructure, £100 million promise in the bank for the A120, A133, and an approval for a £2 billion valuation garden community, which is going to be absolutely critical to our meeting of housing demand. So, you know, in terms of return in investment for the local authorities and government as a whole, this may have fallen short and did of expectation, but it was a, you know, it's a huge result if we were able to be independent-minded. So there is information has been provided. You have had scrutiny. I really counsel you not to go and try and unpick this. By all means, look at lessons learned. Ask the questions about what the tests would be going forward. But it would seem to me, frankly, a horrific and arid process to try and restart the clock this late in the day. This project's coming to a close. That's the biggest single lesson for us to take. This project's coming to a close. What we have to concentrate on is making a success under huge pressure from government to get housing numbers to move, to get a success of TCP. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor King. Councillor Willetts, you had your hand up first before Councillor Bourne, so I'll come to you and then I will let Councillor Bourne speak.
Chairman, I find it incredibly disappointing that a scrutiny panel doesn't have the will to scrutinise one of our major projects in the way that it should have been done. And I won't repeat the way it should have been done, but we should look at it to ensure that we have value for money. I get the impression that that there's not the willingness, and Councillor King has, who's senior member, has forcibly put that we should not be doing that. So I take my lead on the authority's view from Councillor King's point. So can I now propose, Chairman, that this panel recommends the Cabinet invite all North Essex Garden Community Limited shareholders authority and the MCHLG take part in an independent audit of North Essex Garden Community Limited overseen by the National Audit Office. If we're not prepared to do the job, we'll find people who could. So that's what I'm proposing. You want me to repeat it, Chairman?
Thank you, Councillor Willetts. Owen, did you? Because I have to admit, my pen did not write there. So
I was going to ask Councillor Barbic, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I didn't catch that myself, and I think it might be helpful for members if Councillor Willetts, if you could repeat that, please. Okay. Thank you, Owen. Councillor Willetts, were you able to repeat that for me? And I'll try and scribble it down at the same time.
Yes. So sorry, my typing isn't too good, and I'm sort of reading what I was doing on the fly. This panel recommends that the Cabinet invites all North Essex Garden Community Limited shareholder authorities and the MCHLG to take part in an independent audit of North Essex Garden Community Limited overseen by the National Audit Office. Probably we don't need a limit because it's this project, isn't it? Audit of North Essex Garden Communities project overseen by the National Audit Office.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Willetts.
Is that reasonably clear? What I'm suggesting is that if we haven't got the appetite to scrutinise this project properly, then we need to go to someone like the National Audit Office who are able to look at it, and they can do it with the willingness of presumably of all our partners.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Willits. Councillor Bourne, did you want to make a point at this stage? I saw your hand was up from earlier.
I think I'd like to make several points, Chair. Yes.
Of course.
I don't agree with Councillor Willits. No surprise there. This panel, this scrutiny panel, we've already heard, has had at least 5 opportunities to scrutinise NEGC, and has done that and asked a lot of questions. We have spent many hours in the past scrutinising the workings of NEGC. The scope of each of those scrutiny meetings has been set by the scrutiny chair. In this local authority, we always give the scrutiny, we think that's the fairest way to do it. Scrutiny is always run by the opposition. We've come to the end of each of those scrutiny meetings. We've written up our recommendations. And in fact, in the last time that NEGC was scrutinised as a business, it received quite a number of plaudits from the scrutiny panel. There has been, I don't want it to look like, because it isn't the reality, that there is no appetite for scrutiny in this borough, because there is an appetite for scrutiny. In fact, we have been bombarded with additional meetings for scrutiny, which we have all agreed to since lockdown. Normally, we wouldn't have meetings in August. We've had many meetings in August, and we have it. There is an extra scrutiny meeting this week. We have one tomorrow as well. So it's 2 in the same week. So it is not fair to say that this panel is not keen on scrutiny, as Councillor Willits is making out. The scope is really important for that. And I think one of the lessons we can learn is all local authorities find it difficult to scrutinise large projects, because those large projects are usually either financed by PFI or they're financed partly from central government. And it is really difficult for the expertise that councillors have to scrutinise the detail of that finances and the major project going forward. Look at HS2. Look at any IT contract run by the NHS. Look at the Tovey plant that ECC have got into difficulties with, and the dire scrutiny around that. It is really difficult. So as we moved into the period of 2013, where we began to, and we only had Colchester Borough Homes that was set up in 2000, just before 2003, to work on as a company that is different from all the other items that we may scrutinise. We probably underestimated the difficulty we would have in scrutinising those companies, and we're scrutinising CCHL tomorrow. So if there is one thing we can learn, is that we need to manage expectations better. What can we do as a local authority to scrutinise, and what can't we do? And the things that we can't do, where can we go to get some of those answers? What can we do? Even if it is, I'm not saying we should do things in secret, but sometimes we do seem to progress ourselves a bit better as a local authority in our understanding as local borough councillors when we meet not in the public gaze. That doesn't mean that we take decisions outside the public gaze, but in order to gain more knowledge about what each project is doing, then we would have some workshop on that. And we certainly have had an awful lot of workshops as well on the local plan and NEGC that have been outside of the public gaze, but have skilled us up. Maybe that is one of the faults we had. As we, as a local authority, as many local authorities up and down the country moved into creating companies, wholly owned companies, we didn't recognise that it would be slightly more, it would be different to scrutinise. You cannot scrutinise a company by committee. You can't do that. So it falls to the scrutiny panel, this assembly here today. So the scope of scrutiny is absolutely vital, because you can't turn around afterwards and say, oh, we didn't know that and we didn't know that. It's the scope of the scrutiny and the chairing of it that needs to make it very clear what we're doing. We ranged wide today outside of the scope. And you know, how much is a National Audit Office implemented scrutiny going to cost us? That sounds, they're not going to come in and do it off they're scrutinising a whole load of stuff at the moment, including HS2. So how much is that going to cost? That could cost more than our share that we've put in already.
Thank you, Councillor Bourne. Councillor King, if you want to make any comments here, because then I will sum up some of the points I've heard and make my own points really rather than questions, because there is a recommendation. Then I will go around again to all panel members to see if there's any further recommendations as well. But I'm sure you want to come in on the response from, or the statement made by Councillor Willets.
Well, I mean, it certainly is interesting. I mean, all I was trying to do, I just want to be clear on my position because I've been quoted. My position, and Councillor Willets recognised this in his earlier remarks, more generous remarks, is to be absolutely supportive of scrutiny because that makes for better governance and better delivery of all that we do as a local authority. And so Councillor Bourne has described very well what the responsibility of scrutiny is and the many opportunities taken, which we have to remember. If you go back over this, we'll have to be about looking at that as well. I can talk to what the administration's attitude will be. I'm sure Councillor Young and others would take a similar view. We will remain democratically accountable. So we support in public session, in private session, 2 members requests for information. Tonight's yet another example. This was a fairly short notice meeting. It was an addition to the calendar. It's been fully served. Let's go back to what the questions were. You know, we're embroidering this as we go. All of the questions asked were answered. As I repeat, just to be clear, many of the assertions about what hasn't been provided made by council, well, it's not true. Information has been made available, has been published. Officers act as they should in representing the facts as they know them. We've done that again tonight. So maybe we're just setting ourselves up for another round because that's the politics. Well, I just, professionally recommend that we don't. The panel will have to decide what you choose to recommend. Don't pull away at what actually, whatever the challenges of complex projects, and more or less consultants in a room don't, I tell you, make that necessarily better. Don't pull away at what is your accountable and democratic institution, the use of scrutiny to demand insight and to hold to account. And I want to be absolutely clear that as in the past, now and in the future, we cooperate completely with that. This is a conversation not about that, and that's what's being suggested. This is not about a willingness to be able to account. This conversation is about what's practical. We together have a responsibility for a new project. We are in the process of closing this one. We need to make a judgment about where our resources should go, having had the debate we have tonight and can continue about value for money. So this is not about not wanting to be accountable. This is about a question of practicality and the value to be gained if you make the recommendation you do. What we then do with that in real practical terms. Hugely expensive, invasive process, which I have to say, if it's serious, it's intended to derail what we've got to do, because the same officers who have to work at the future will have to spend countless weeks and months looking at the past. And I frankly, professionally, I see very limited value. That's my advice, but we are open to take your judgment, your verdict, and we'll take it with the same seriousness as we have done before on this and other matters.
Thank you, Councillor King, for those points and your perspective on the recommendation put forward by Councillor Willets. I will try and sum up some of the points I think I've heard this evening and also give an indication of my view on the direction of travel based on what I've heard this evening. We talk about the money side of this, very much importantly so, but Councillor Willits did raise a good point about some of the strategic plans of the projects as well, which I think have equal merit. Because when we discuss North Essex Garden Communities and the company, we're discussing a process in particular that will have unprecedented impact on our communities for generations to come. It is the most important decision any of us are likely to be involved in local government. It is going to have the most far-reaching consequences, involve the most amount of money. It is sometimes easy to forget quite how unprecedented these schemes are. And I don't think it's surprising, therefore, that when we discuss this issue, there is disagreement on various aspects of it. And I've listened to some of the points raised tonight, and I think for me, there's some key outstanding legal questions, constitutional questions, financial questions, and of course, there's the political debate as well. I think central to this, particularly when we're speaking about the £350,000 contribution, is who exactly is the shareholder, and defining our relationship in any company going forward, any arrangement going forward, about who is that shareholder. Is it the portfolio holder that goes to the meetings, or is it all 51 members of the council? And I think that really came down to the central aspect of the debates we've had when we've been discussing the release of the £350,000, which really is where a lot of the debate has occurred right now. And that's where the fissures have occurred about what we think our relationship is with the company. In the recent debate, we spoke about money owed, and it's been alluded to this evening about representations or agreements with the other authorities. And I've not yet seen any documentation that confirms a relationship that means we had to give £350,000. I've yet to see that, and that is, I think, a problem, because we don't understand our relationship that we've promised with the other authorities in NEGC. And I think that's a key constitutional, potentially legal question. Not saying there's anything untoward, but understanding who has the legal authority to make certain decisions on behalf of the authority, how that relationship plays out. And there is, as was mentioned to us ahead of the full council meeting, there is effectively undeterminative case law on this issue. It is in the air at the moment, going through courts. It's not conclusive about duties owed to other partners in such a relationship. So I do think there's some outstanding question on understanding our role as a shareholder, understanding who we made representations to, saying we would make contributions, because from my perspective, for the last 2 years at least, it's been clear there is a resistance in the wider council chamber, if not in the administration. That's not a political point, that's what it's sort of a political point, but it's just representative of fact that there is a view taken by the administration as the executive and the wider council chamber. You can, I mean, probably the easiest metaphor is Brexit in Parliament pre-general election 2019, where there is a difference of opinion between executive and legislative, for want of a better word. So I think there's some outstanding questions there. I mean, one of the biggest points that it was only really touched on slightly is the land deal issue, which for me was one of the main reasons NEGC was pursuing work, was to tie up some of those land deals, and it spent considerable sums on pursuing those land deals, but came up empty-handed. And certainly if we were ever going to pursue a similar model in future as local authorities, we really need to understand how that went wrong. Why is it that we were unsuccessful through that model in achieving the land deals that NEGC hoped to do? I mean, ultimately, if we look at the objectives of NEGC and look at the outcomes, on balance, I would say it hadn't been a success. I mean, there has been successes. I don't think you should ever diminish. I mean, if I give the benefit of the doubt in to do with infrastructure, I mean, I know it's a debatable point, but they went out and arguably helped secure some infrastructure funding, but ultimately the project fell short for whatever reason. So I do think we need to understand those lessons about why some of the objectives NEGC set itself, we set NEGC as authorities, it failed to achieve. On the recommendation that Councillor Willits has made, I think it's an interesting argument, and the discussion so far this evening, I'm not quite sure yet we've reached a point where there is still a slight defensiveness about what we did, rather than necessarily attempting to fully embrace learning what went wrong. And I think that's part of politics, isn't it? I mean, it's easy to get very angry in politics because you don't want to admit mistakes, because at every level and with every party, they are seized upon by opposition and made use of for, you know, well, democracy is part of the democratic process, but I do think there is still a defensiveness about the project. And from my perspective, I think it's important we learn lessons if we're going to move forward from this. And I'm not convinced at the moment that we are in a position where we want to really learn lessons. And I do think, and I've said it previously, that there is merit, I believe, in getting external organisations, whoever that is, to look at this process, the constitutional, legal, financial questions, to understand fully, because this is unprecedented, as we were told repeatedly. Nothing like this has been attempted for decades, since Milton Keynes, since the turn of World War II. It really is unprecedented in scale. And Councillor Vaughan probably made the most compelling argument for bringing in independent auditors, external organisations, is that actually this is way beyond some of our capacity that we have as councillors, and the limit to what we can understand and provide as councillors on Scrutiny Panel, I think, has a limit. And the fact that we have scrutinised this, not me personally, but the panel has scrutinised this for 5 to 6 times, I think it was cited, I think is, and we haven't necessarily got the bottom of everything, is probably an example of the limit to this panel can achieve on this matter without bringing in external assistance. So I am sympathetic to the view of bringing in independent auditors, and it also takes away the politics. It also ticks the boxes of bringing in all other parties, because that is something that's repeatedly been cited, and I completely agree with Councillor Young. Culture Council should not take, in further discussions, the brunt of all focus. It should have all authorities involved, and also I do think the ministry, because it's important to understand their thinking going forward. And I'm fully open to to inviting them along to any discussions if they're willing to come along. I think that's a very important point. So I certainly do have sympathy with that recommendation for those reasons, because there's still some key outstanding questions about carried costs, about the banker role, about how we present that, about shareholder role, with constitutional questions, some of the legal arrangements. I think there are too many outstanding questions for us to achieve after a couple of hours on the scrutiny panel. I really do think this is a substantial lesson that needs to be learned. So I'd be very open to that, but also I'm interested to hear further recommendations from the panel as well on this matter this evening, if alternatives are suggested about how we can take this forward. I saw Councillor Vaughan, your hand went up in the middle of my attempt at summary and points raised, and then Councillor Dundas also raised his hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. No, I thought that was a fair summary that you made there, absolutely capturing the points. I am concerned about having someone like the National Audit Office, because we would have to ask there's no point in just looking at what we did. I think we've established that. It's a large project by many local authorities. I think the recommendation we could agree on, possibly, is that we use the usual system that we have for this kind of event, which is looking at LGA peer review, because we have a number of local authorities in our area, not Essex, but in the Eastern region and further afield, who have been through major projects. In fact, Essex actually are really generally really good and experienced at major projects. They have a major projects team. We don't have a major projects team as such, but they do. But the LGA peer review system would enable us to go out on a scope of friendly fire, if you like, whereby the LGA, we would look for someone that was experienced in running a major project, and they would come through and they would be able to, because they use that local government language, they would be able to come in, lift all the drawers, because going back to your original analogy, Chair, of inviting ourselves round to the neighbours or inviting the neighbours round. You know, getting the National Audit Office in and doing all of that is like going round to the neighbour's house without an invoice, like opening all their drawers and doors, eating their tea and cake, leaving the crumbs and leaving without even saying thank you. An LGA peer review is something, I wouldn't say it's easy, because it isn't easy, but it involves a number of stakeholders. So it would involve backbenchers, it would involve cabinet, it would involve officers, and it would involve everybody that was involved in the project, and can also include DCLG, because that's obviously that's local government as well. So I would be happy to support that recommendation. I do worry about the price of National Audit Office and getting, and whether we learn anything from it, because I know that every single peer review we've ever had in our local authority has given us things to think about, even outside the scope. And people don't come in and blow sunshine at us with a peer review, and we send our officers off and our councillors off to do peer reviews in other local authorities as well. And it's a really rigorous way of doing things. So I don't know what others think about that, but I'd be happy to put forward that recommendation, an LGA peer review.
Thank you, Councillor. Sorry, thank you, Councillor Bourne, for that. And I think there was a recommendation of sorts, and well, there was, I think, in there. Owen, I don't know if you had noted anything down, but I will. Councillor Dundas, I saw you raise your hand, but I'm gonna just jump to Dan Gascoigne because he raised his hand, and I presume it's in response to Councillor Bourne's points. So I don't know whether he wants to follow up quickly before I invite you to speak.
Yeah, I think it's just making sure that any recommendation is something that's going to have some legs. I think for the panel to make recommendations that rely on the participation of the other partners, I just worry that there are risks to the ability to actually execute that. I tend to agree with the sentiment from Councillor Bourne in terms of the National Audit Office. I think their role is to audit Parliament's spending and decisions. Clearly, they have a role in terms of the code of audit code, which our local auditors respond to. I'm not sure what their role would be in this. There would clearly need to be some budget set aside for any auditors to come in. I think that could be quite a significant budget, certainly over 100,000. I would have thought we'd need to look into that, but certainly a significant budget requirement. But my main point, I think, is just making sure that the recommendation, as I say, would stand up with other partners. They would need to be on board, surely, for the recommendation to be fulfilled. As for the peer review, funnily enough, we were looking at an LGA peer review potentially this year. It was delayed, as with so many other things, with the COVID pandemic. And again, I think but my same point would stand in terms of the other partners being willing to sign up to an LGA peer review. I think that would be quite challenging to get the County Council and 2 other districts to sign up to a joint peer review at this time. But by all means, consider that recommendation.
Thank you. Just for the benefit of everybody, could Councillor Bourne, I don't know if you were able to answer this particular point, but what exactly a peer review by the LGA involves? Is it they send someone in to discuss with us what happened and maybe make recommendations back to council? How does that necessarily work? Or if Dan Gascoigne you know at all?
Yeah, well, I, like many councillors, have been involved in quite a lot of peer reviews, and yeah, you scope out what you want to find out, and the LGA will find suitable, experienced LGA peer reviews. They're usually senior members of a local authority, district, borough, county, metropolitan, that have experience in those particular fields. We've had one before on rough sleepers, we've had one before on all sorts of things. The recommendations are public, and it's done like an interview system, a bit like well, a bit like an Ofsted inspection, really.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Councillor Dundas, sorry.
That's all right. Thank you, Chair. I was going to suggest you went to Mr. Gascoigne first, actually, because that made a lot more sense. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a sort of general theme, I think, coming out of this, that I haven't been on this panel. I've been on this panel just over a year, so I haven't scrutinised NEGC that many times. But I feel that there are only so many times I can basically ask Councillor King and Councillor Young in particular the same questions, and there's probably only so many times they can give the same answers. And I'm inclined to feel that in terms of our scrutiny, with the information we've got available, we have to a certain extent perhaps gone as far as we can in the current sort of venue. And I think the other points were made about councillors in general. You know, councillors are enthusiastic, willing amateurs at the end of the day. You know, we're not, well, some of us may be, but most of us aren't professional auditors in terms of auditing a project like this. And I think the comments about we need to find out the views from others and not just CBC directors or people or officers involved is also fair, because I think we know their answers, we know their opinions. Again, there's only so many times we can ask those questions. So that we move on to where we go from here. I mean, I know there's people out there calling for a public inquiry. It's not something I would support, because I think it would probably cost more than the whole project cost in the first place. It might get some answers, and I'm sure a lot of people would love to come along and represent themselves and give evidence, but you know, where does that take us, and is that really the right way to go? My inclination is it's not. I'll be absolutely honest, I'm not that familiar with the LGA peer review. It does sound an interesting option, I think. I think how we need to think about it is, when it comes to setting the criteria for that review, who sets it and how do we set it? Does it come back to this panel to set the criteria? That would seem the logical thing to do. Before Councillor Willits made his recommendation, I was actually going to make, I know I sound like a dog with a bone on this subject. I was going to make a recommendation of my own regarding the 350,000, because I'm sorry, having been voted on in full council so many times, I do think somewhere in the line there has to be a recognition that was the decision council took. And my recommendation, what I was going to say, is that this panel, I've just scribbled this now, or typed it out quickly. This panel recommends that Cabinet advises that following the setting of the 1920 budget by full council on February the 20th, 2019, and votes in full council on December the 5th, 2019, and July the 15th, 2020, there is no authority to write off or disregard any amounts owed to CBC, including carried costs, and any accounts or final budgetary position by NEGC should show those amounts as outstanding. I just think that would be an honest opinion as to where it ended up. I'm not suggesting we take it any further, but I think that would just be an honest final balance, which really reflects what's actually happened. So I'll put that on the table as an addition to whatever we do regarding the LGA peer review or the NAO. I don't know what an NAO would cost. Officers might want to comment on that. I assume there's a cost attached to an LGA peer review. I don't know if anybody knows where we head in budgetary terms with that. But yeah, that's what I would like to add as a second suggestion, as a recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Dundas. Owen, did you get that down all okay? Okay.
Yes,
perfect.
Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
You want me to email it to you, Owen? Because I've just typed it up.
By all means, yes, that'll help me look at it when it comes to
cut and paste.
Okay,
yes,
thank you.
I'd be interested in, sorry, Chairman, I'd be interested in Councillor King's response to that proposal.
Thank you. Yeah, I was going to invite Councillor King and Councillor Young to speak. I just wanted to double check. Did anyone want to take the break now for 10 minutes or so, up to 1:30, just because we have ended up going an hour almost beyond? How time flies when we're all having fun together, hey, at the family dinner. But I just want to check if anyone wants a quick break before or after I invite Councillor King and Young in. Anybody? No. Going once, going twice. Okay, fine. I will invite Councillor King to speak first. I think his hand went up before Councillor Young's.
Thank you, Chair. I think they're all desperate to come towards the finishing line, I suspect. We'll see whether bladders and finish line will match. I want to go back first. I want to thank Councillor Willits for sparking a really good discussion, which has led us to acknowledge, you know, where councillors, despite our, and we do have a lot of expertise, let's not underestimate that collectively, and recognise the challenges for us collectively also in terms of what we seek to do through scrutiny or otherwise. And I think that was fair, and I think it was a good challenge. Thank you, Councillor Willits, you know, about what we do for the next steps. I want to thank you, Lewis, because your capture of some of the points of subtlety around constitutional position or not. I think I would just say it would have been perhaps a help if we had had those on the list of questions for tonight, but they were in the air and you have mentioned them. I think it will be right to acknowledge that there is a tension about the answer, and I think it will be, you know, fair if we try to at least acknowledge that and sort of pin that down. And to Councillor Dundas, I think my only observation, you know, Paul Cook's the financier, so I have to take his direction. I know you're an accountant, so you two can go into a darkened room and see who comes out. I think probably a score draw. But for me, I think the question would not be about what we show, because that can be, no doubt there are conventions here and can be shown a number of ways, including the one you described. I think my point would be what next. So your recommendation, I think, begs a question about what you're seeking to do, which is, are you seeking to stop any kind of reconciliation between the parties of two irreconcilable facts at the moment, which is our partners expect 350k, and we strictly could say, where's our carry cost? I think the time Paul Cook's added up the last few months, they'd be much the same. In fact, it might even be that our partners owe us more than we might owe them. But one way or another, for a winding up to be successful, we've got to come to some kind of conclusion. And I've heard nobody say that they want to impede the winding up of NEGC Limited, or further impede, I think is actually the reality, further impede the transition across to whatever we need to do, including a vehicle for it, for TCB. So I just ask you, Paul, just to think about that, because I think that's the conditionality for any being explicit and any seeking to bind Cabinet's hand. Perhaps as you've done the drafting, you might think about that, because I do not think that you would want to say that you want to in any way at all impede the resolution of the current arrangements between the parties, because unless they're resolved, you know, we can't form a new relationship, and the money will be in the coffers for that vehicle, and we will be at odds with the people we will have to work through. And I know that this is kind of a sore point, but I know that your sense of practicality will acknowledge it, that we do have to move on at some stage. Whatever we do about taking judgment about what's happened, we've still got to resolve this. So it's a suggestion to you to think about that, and it's a suggestion to the panel to recognise that in practical terms, the administration has got to find a way with its partners. It wouldn't be the best of starts for a wider conversation either, would it? To be honest, if we're really serious about trying to learn some lessons that might be of value to more than just CBC, to say up yours on the 350k, and by the way, we want our money back. You know, that would not be the best of starts. We've done ourselves some damage to what are very good, hard-won relationships, and they deserve not just us to be right, because I respect that councillors have their view. They may be right. We've got to be better than right. We've got to be wise, and so finding a way ahead's got to have some wisdom. And Cabinet, well, that's our responsibility, standing above the fray to do that. But I'd rather it came to us in a way that helped that process and try to sort of narrow some of the gaps. My last point, that's good, isn't it? My last point would be really about the nature of a review. Of the alternatives, by far the most practical and I have no defensiveness, Lewis, about this at all, honestly, would be a look at the real list of things that have been a bugbear, including, and I think it's probably more about visibility, things like land deals and so on, where I suspect we'd find a lot of good work done and more progress than we know. It's just not been made visible because these things tend to be, by their nature, discrete affairs in which the prize is cashed later. But that to one side, that's a commentary. I think we need to have a narrow scope. I would recommend, if we, Councillor Bourne's choice, because that understanding how government works locally will make a huge difference to effectiveness. And although it'll be expensive, it'll be cheaper than the alternative if we're to consider it as cabinet on your collective behalf. And I would say again that the scope should be one that looks to what will help us moving ahead. So what is it that we think is most applicable to the challenges we'll face in setting up a new vehicle and the work that officers will have to do underneath that authority? So my recommendation is always take the Councillor Bourne approach, because that's wisdom itself, but narrow and tighten the focus to sort of fit where we're heading rather than necessarily where we've been. And we can do that in the detail later, but it would be good to have the panel at least acknowledge it. And then, Lewis, that can pick up on your constitutional points, in my view, as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor King. I think it was Councillor Julie Young who was next, followed by Paul Cook.
Yeah, I think just on the way the 350k is shown in the accounts. I mean, you know, I'm a lay person, Paul. So you are an accountant, but I would have thought when you're closing down a company, to try and close off a company's accounts with a line that says 350,000 owing, Companies House are going to have some questions about that, which sounds messy to me. But what do I know? I'm not a professional accountant, but we do have professionals that work for Colchester Borough Council will be able to navigate that on our behalf, and I'm sure they'll do a good job at that. And I think it is about trusting our officers and their expertise in terms of how they prepare our accounts. So, you know, I'd be interested in seeing what Paul has to say about that. And just a few words about an LGA review team that hasn't already been covered. It is a team that arrives at an authority with a distinct a focus to their review. And that will generally be a senior officer, a senior appropriate officer on that particular topic, along with some councillors in that team. And they generally try to choose councillors of the opposite political persuasion to the incumbent administration. And that is about giving that level of scrutiny and you know, and not going to see your political friends and patting them on the back. So it is a rigorous review that takes place, and those people that are involved in that have to stand behind that report. So I don't think it's a light touch. I think it is an appropriate opportunity for the scrutiny panel to move forward with that isn't going to cost us 100,000. And given our financial position, we do have to think about value for money, councillors, don't we?
Thank you, Councillor Young. Good points made there. I will bring in Paul Cook, who raised his hand to speak.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just reiterate, I do feel the way that the project has been accounted for is appropriate, but also make the point that the reserve that is in the Colchester accounts is held on behalf of some other authorities as well who have contributed. So it just seems a bit curious that of that fund that we hold on partly on their behalf, we're intending to pay Colchester the carrying costs, but not make our contribution. And normally, I'm sure Ian will come in on this, decisions about the use of the pooled funds, if I could put it that way, are made jointly by the partners looking at the business plan and other proposals. So I don't think normally there have been unilateral decisions that, you know, one authority will pay this out of the funds held jointly. It's usually done as a joint decision unanimously between the partners. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. I think this issue on the 350,000 is a debate that's has not necessarily been concluded as yet, and I don't think we've really all reached an agreed position on how that came about, which I think is one of the outstanding points to look into. I'm just gonna bring Councillor Willits, I think went first before Councillor Dundas, and then I will propose something that I hope does bring in all the points that have been raised and can get agreement across the panel. Councillor Willits, did you want to go first?
Yes, Chairman. I mean, sorry if I set their hair running by suggesting the National Audit Office. It's just that I've been reading one of their reports and they seem to do it particularly well. So they were at the front of my mind. We're mind reading the other authorities. We don't actually know whether they would subscribe to a review of the project by the National Audit Office or another similar sort of completely independent national institution, which to my mind would probably be one of the best ways of doing it. So I mean, I'm happy for my sort of first recommendation to be modified so that perhaps there is an option. We go for an independent audit, but we leave it open to go for a peer review, perhaps consulting the other partners in the project on where they would want to go. I think we should be flexible, but I still think it should be an independent review because we don't seem to have marshalled our activities together, and as been put cogently by others, there are other things which perhaps our officers should be doing rather than learning the lessons of the past. But without those lessons, perhaps they won't do the future as well as they might otherwise have done. So, I mean, certainly let's have a bit of flexibility about that.
Thanks.
If it will get the majority support of the scrutiny panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I've got some wording that I'll propose as a recommendation in a moment. I would say that I think from memory, Councillor Willits, your original proposal was a recommendation to invite all the other authorities. And one of the criticisms I had when setting the scope of this meeting was not inviting the other authorities. So I don't think it's an argument that can hold that a reason not to bring in external investigation or LGA peer review, however, is that the other authorities may not come out, because one of the things I was asked was to bring the other authorities. So that would be sort of illogical, really, as a grounds against it. But I will propose some words in a minute after Councillor Dundas has spoken.
Thanks, Joe. I was just going to come back on a few of the comments, and I do take them. I mean, as far as Companies House are concerned, the limited company aspect is actually a very small part of it. It's the project, which is the primary thing we're closing down. So I wouldn't actually expect Companies House to be particularly involved in this. If it were all a limited company, well then, yeah, if that debt's sitting there, then you would need something saying that the creditor, which is Colchester Borough Council, has written that off and will not pursue it. The problem is, following the votes in full council, the CBC doesn't, to my mind, really have the authority to write that off. I mean, the problem is, you know, we spent all these evenings talking about it and voting on it in full council in virtual and actual format. We can't just ignore that. It happened. So if we just completely arbitrarily write that off, we are effectively doing exactly what full council voted against doing, and I'm not quite sure how that sits with the governance of of the council, and that does worry me if we do that. I think it should worry everybody else, because there's no doubt by completely writing that off, you are going against the express will of full council. I can't see there's any other way to interpret it. And I know it's difficult. To use the expression, you know, democracy is a terrible system, but it's better than all the others we've tried. And sometimes democracy does get in the way of being able to do convenient deals. And we are a little bit stuck in having to balance our future relationship with our neighbours and the democratic votes which have already happened. But all I'm saying is I just don't think you can pretend they haven't happened, because they have, they exist, they're on record, and that will has been expressed, and that has to be reflected somewhere. Otherwise, down the line, somebody is going to come a cropper. That's all I'm saying, because, you know, people will ask questions, maybe not in the council, but certainly somewhere.
Thank you, Councillor Dundas. Okay, so I've sort of listened to try and get a balance between everyone's views on this as a recommendation to take forward, because I am particularly interested in this LGA peer review, and one of my concerns about bringing in independent external auditors would be the potential cost. But I do think it's an option that should be considered nonetheless, and not ruled out necessarily at this stage without understanding perhaps the cost implications involved. So if I can make this recommendation to the panel, well, this panel recommends that Cabinet invite all NEGC limited shareholders, limited shareholder authorities. Let me just get this up on my computer. I'll start again, so I wrote it a bit more coherently on my laptop rather than my terrible handwriting. All right, I'll start again. This panel recommends that Cabinet invites all North Essex Garden Community limited shareholder authorities and the MCHLG to take part in an external independent audit and or LGA peer review of North Essex Garden Communities Limited, and the terms of reference of either of those are set by the scrutiny panel. That way I think we can keep some of the points that have been raised about scrutiny losing control perhaps of the process, but it's probably not the right turn of phrase, but letting go of control of the process, I hope is addressed by the terms of reference being set by the scrutiny panel in future. Any paper that goes to Cabinet, I would hope would include a cost benefit analysis of what is involved with either or the external independent audit and or LGA peer review. I would be disappointed if we just ruled either out without knowing the facts at this stage. Committing a recommendation to Cabinet doesn't mean that we're allocating those funds or agreeing to funds. So I do think that Cabinet can just decide based on the options presented to it what may be the best course of action, looking at all the facts, and then we set the terms of reference going forward, so there's that accountability as well. So I hope that would compromise on all the points that have been made this evening for what we take to Cabinet. So that would be my recommendation. Councillor Willits, do you have a further point on this?
Yes, Chairman. I would happily withdraw my recommendation in favour of yours, or propose your recommendation as an amendment to mine, whichever the clerk says is the correct way of doing it. What I would ask though, when I was drafting earlier on, I put North Essex Garden Communities Limited rather than North Essex Garden Communities Project. And you must have been using my text as the original because you repeated that. And I think the scrutiny is on the project, not on the limited.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chairman, I have Councillor Willits seconding your motion. Yeah, sorry, seconding your recommendation.
Councillor Willits, sorry, did you think there needed to be an amendment from the limited to the project for what I said? Did you use that?
Yes, Chairman, when you read out your alternative, you still got the North Essex Garden Communities Limited there, whereas it should be the project that we're scrutinising. There really is nothing to scrutinise in the limited company. It's never done anything and it's gone. It's the project that we want to know we've got value for money.
That's great. Thanks for the clarification. I've made that amendment.
Okay, fine. Councillor Bourne, did you want to come in here?
Oh, I'm happy to support that, Chair. I do, with a slight caveat on the scrutiny panel decided the terms of reference, because this is a Colchester Borough Council scrutiny panel deciding the terms of reference on behalf of all the other local authorities.
Yeah.
So I think there may be some sort of compromise that we have to make as a scrutiny panel when it does come back, because the other local authorities may feel, well, slightly cross about that, in the same way that we might feel, you know, why is another local authority setting terms of reference for some kind of review involving us? So I think there might need some compromise later down the line.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I'll keep it in just for now, so we have our role still to play, but I think that's a very fair point that we should, in doing so, be very much aware of when it comes back at a later date. I agree. That is a good point. Okay. Sorry, I thought I saw another hand up. I just wanted. Oh yeah, goodness, Councillor King. Sorry. Hello. I just assume it's up.
It is, and as helpfully as I can make it. I think you should soften off that language a little bit. I mean, it's for the reason that's just been described by Councillor Tina Bourne. In effect, this is going to be an executive function in the sense that there's going to have to be some toing. If we want this to happen, there's going to have to be some toing and froing to find out what others will agree. You know, we play a pretty straight bat, you may not think it. So if we sort of say, we kind of take the point and we see the will of scrutiny, we're going to have Julie and I will have to talk to colleagues who haven't had this conversation. If we're going to try and make this real, it's going to be a bit complicated. Not least the fact we have no authority over others. So I think you need to give as much scope. And I'd be honest, given where Councillor Willits has got himself to in terms of having had the spark of the idea, having got himself sadly looking at NAO, and then accepting that perhaps that isn't the most appropriate, and I don't think it is, vehicle. The point of review and audit in terms of LGA is the one on which I think there is consensus, and that will work better. That's your bet. If you really want to do this, this is your best prospect of getting agreement with the other parties. So, you know, I am really genuinely trying to be helpful here. I would pair this back to LGA peer review, because that, in my view, is where it will go. And you give some scope on the rest of the language talks about scope to be agreed. And there's some honour here that with the officers will do, officers and cabinet members will do their best they can to achieve that rather than frustrate it, because you know the scope for frustration is significant. So the point's a reasonable one. The LGA is a vehicle that your counterparts will recognise elsewhere. And so it's just trying to appeal to your pragmatism, really, which has been my point halfway through this conversation, which is there's no point just making a point. If you want this to happen, you need to choose a vehicle as a panel that's got a chance of getting past cabinet and then being accepted by our counterparts, who are going to be, let's be honest about this, pretty out of sorts given everything else that's happened.
Thank you, Councillor King. I would still like to include reference to scrutiny panel in any recommendation, maybe to change set to agreed by scrutiny panel, because then that gives us some roles still in the process to make sure we're included. I think that would then at least acknowledge that it's not solely down to us.
You could use the word with. So I mean, you know, but that's up to you. Let's not wordsmith now. But the deeper point is the one about being careful not to set off and say you want a national organisation to look at a national organisation, you know, the ministry, and 4 district and county councils. You know, you're setting the bar too high is all I'm suggesting to you, and I'll stop at that.
Thank you. Look, okay, I think we're getting closer altogether. Let me just try and repeat the recommendation, Owen, with a couple of minor changes, just so we know where we're at. And then I think I won't change what I'm proposing any further. This panel recommends that Cabinet invite all North Essex Garden Community Limited shareholder authorities and the MCHLG to take part in an external independent audit and or LGA peer review of the North Essex Garden Community Project. And then I would put including North Essex Garden Communities Limited, so it stays within the scope there. And the terms of references are agreed by scrutiny panel. And I think that would be I think that would then take in everything, and it would then be down to Cabinet based on what's presented to them to decide the most appropriate course of action. But we don't then rule anything out at this stage.
Are you happy with that, Councillor Bourne?
I thought we were just going to put an independent review without stating, because there might be another one that comes along that's even better than the LGA review. I don't know. But if you want to put both in, I think Councillor King makes a very good point. If we truly want the other partners to come in with this, then putting the National Audit Office is probably going to put them off.
I have dropped the National Audit Office from it. National Audit Office is not mentioned in the recommendation. It refers to external independent audit, and that hopefully that covers any alternative that we may think more appropriate in the future. But I haven't mentioned National Audit Office in my recommendation.
Okay, my brain at this time of night is on a time.
Yeah, that's fine. I've tried to bring in all the points that have been raised. That's my personal final recommendation. There is others on the table, including from Councillor Dundas. What I will do quickly, Owen, if you'll have, Councillor Young, sorry, you've raised your hand, and then this will be the final comment before I go round everyone else, just for final words before we second and vote on things. Councillor Young, do you want to raise a point?
All I was going to say is I think scrutiny works better and well if there's a good relationship between scrutiny and portfolio holders and cabinet members. And I suppose I'm, wading in really to support Councillor King's ask, is that the terms of that LGA review or that audit is shaped in a collaborative way, rather than it being seen as, the scrutiny are going to be the ones that frame that. If we could be allowed to do that and shape that as a collective, I think that would actually bear fruit. And I think there will be things that you will want in there based on the discussions we've had tonight. But I think in terms of being reaching out a little bit to our partners and using it as a springboard for the future, there might be things that they would want to see in that as well, which would be useful. And I don't think we should rule that out or put too tight a frame on it that we can't include things, because generally a peer review doesn't come in. It's not like an audit committee thing. It is a much wider thing. You can put things in the scope, but hopefully we could come up with a collective approach that would actually be much more sort of supportive rather than drilling down in a negative way.
Thank you, Councillor Young. In response, Owen, to Councillor Young and King's comments, I'll change the by scrutiny to with scrutiny to promote collaborative working on that front. As long as scrutiny has a say on the process and can help agree it, not just be paid lip service to, I think that's important and would reflect the points made by members of all parties this evening. So just sorry to change it once again, but from by scrutiny to with scrutiny. Okay, I will whip round then. Thank you everyone for the comments made. It's a lot longer than I thought it would be when I said let's finish off after 7:30, but I'm glad we got a compromise on this evening. I will go around reverse alphabetical this time. Councillor Willett, was there anything further you wish to add before we move to votes?
No, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Lorcan-Whitehead.
Mr. Chairman, sorry, just to just when we do come to the vote, I know it's pedantic, but I'll just need to get confirmation from Councillor Willett that he seconds the motion with the amended wording.
Yeah, it's probably best if we just read out, because I think there's another couple on the table, just to check if that's okay. Thank you. Councillor Lorcan-Whitehead.
Nothing further from me, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Sam McCarthy.
Nothing from me either, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Mike Hogg.
Nothing further, Chairman.
Thank you. Councillor Chris Hayter.
No, nothing here.
Thank you. Councillor Paul Dundas.
You'll be delighted to know I have nothing to add at this time.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bourne.
No, I'm delighted we've got to the end. I would just say that in the spirit of trying to make it non-political, that the reason for having the independent inquiry is not represented on social media tomorrow or tonight as some other reason why Scrutiny Panel is doing that, because if we truly want other partners to take part, then it needs to be collaborative.
Yeah.
I will duly keep my eye out for excitable social media posts this evening and in the morning, Councillor Bourne. I almost read out Councillor Lewis Barber. That would have been mad if I'd asked myself there what I thought. So yeah, I think that's everyone done then. Thank you, everyone. Owen, did you just want to confirm the recommendations are on the table, and then we'll see if there's any seconders for them? Are you okay with that?
Okay, yep. So firstly, just to confirm, Councillor Willits, you're happy to withdraw the recommendation that you made, and second, Councillor Barber's recommendation, which I'll cover.
Agreed. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor. Let's have a look back through here. I think it's probably yes. So then we had Councillor Bourne. You recommended that we look at an LGA peer review as opposed to an NAO audit. So are you happy to withdraw that in the light of Councillor Barber's recommendation?
Yes, I am, because it's been incorporated. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you. So I think, Mr. Chairman, that just leaves us with the standing recommendation that you meet. Oh, hang on.
Councillor Dundas, I think, had one as well, didn't he, from memory?
Regarding the £350,000 recommendation, that Cabinet advises that following the setting of the 2019-20 budgets and the later votes that you mentioned, there is no authority to write off carry costs, and that these should be shown on financial tables and documents. Sorry, balance sheets. That's a better way of saying it. Councillor Dundas, are you happy with that wording that I have?
Yeah, no, that sounds good to me. I put the dates in. I cut and pasted an email, but you might need to check the dates. But yeah, that's fine.
Right. Do I have a second for that, Mr. Chairman? Would you be happy for us to take that recommendation, then move on to yours?
Yep, that's fine. And I think I just saw Councillor Chris Hayter indicate second.
Correct.
That's great. So what I'll do is I'll proceed in alphabetical order through members of the panel and ask for you to confirm your votes for the recommendation, against the recommendation, or to abstain. So I'll start with you, Mr. Chairman. For. Councillor Bourne.
Sorry, Owen, is this for both recommendations en bloc?
This is just a single recommendation from Councillor Dundas regarding how the 350,000 is accounted for.
Against.
Against. Councillor Dundas.
For.
Councillor Hayter.
For.
Councillor Hogg.
Against.
Against. Councillor McCarthy.
Against.
Against. Councillor Whitehead.
Against.
Against. And Councillor Willits.
For.
So I make that a tied vote, Mr. Chairman, of 4 votes each. Now, this hasn't happened whilst I've been on duty at the council, but I believe that leaves it with you as the chairman of the night with the casting vote.
I'll use that in support of the recommendation. Thank you.
Okay, so with the chairman's casting vote, that recommendation is approved to go forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that takes us on to the. I think this is the final recommendation that I have noted, the one that you put forward, Mr. Chairman, to supersede the 2 made beforehand. The panel recommends that Cabinet invites all NEGC project shareholder local authorities and MHCLG to take part in an external audit and or LGA peer review of the NEGC project, with terms of reference being agreed with by the scrutiny panel.
There was just on the first line, it was just for so it sort of makes sense, I guess. It's the North Essex Garden Community Limited shareholders, not project there, just because that defines then who exactly the authorities are, because there's no shareholders of the project per se. But
Thank you. Yes, that's absolutely right. Yeah.
Sorry, and then it was just independent external audit, but I don't think it pays particularly. Yeah. Okay.
Indeed. And so just to check, Councillor Willits, you're happy to second that still with the amended voting?
Happy to do anything to get to dinner. Yes,
well, so thank you, Councillor. So likewise, I shall go through the members of the panel and ask for you to vote for, against, or to abstain with regard to that recommendation. So, Councillor Barber.
For.
Councillor Bourne. For. Councillor Dundas. For. Councillor Hayter. For. Councillor Hogg. For. Councillor McCarthy. For. Councillor Whitehead. For. And Councillor Willits.
For.
So I make that a unanimous vote to approve that recommendation to go to Cabinet, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you, everybody, for that discussion, and to officers and to Councillor Young and Councillor King as well for attending this evening. So that well, that's the end, I think, of item 10. We'll be pleased to move on to item 11, which will be substantially shorter because there is no items under this. There's nothing discussed on this particular item, which means all matters of business are being conducted this evening, and the meeting is now, I believe, closed. So that is us done for the evening, and I will see you all tomorrow for more fun.
Thank you, Chair. Good night.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you all. See you later. Thank you, Owen. Bye.